Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku is trapped in a cage by his dad? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Shota Aizawa woke up to the sound of his insufferable fur child meowing boisterously in his ear, light paws of fluff kneading his hair like it was a stray piece of yarn he'd found on the floor. The man, who barely slept enough as it was, muffled a groan as he dragged lead-feeling hands down his face. The sound caused the cat to spring upwards, back curling as it gave a large stretch before taking its place directly on his chest and letting an even louder meow out at him. He found himself questioning the rationality of having this nuisance as his eyes adjusted to the light of the morning, squinting as the cat before him simply stared. "Remind me again why I decided to take you in?" The man rasped, glaring at the cat perched comfortably on his chest. The small black ball of fur didn't seem fazed, flashing its green eyes at him innocently like it had done nothing wrong. Its face had Shota's resolve slowly beginning to crumble by the second. In all honesty, Shota wasn't as mad as he probably should have been, considering the cat had woken him from the first full sleep he'd received in a long time. He'd been lonely the past few days, since his husband had left on hero work that took him away for almost a week, and the soft comforting bundle of fur had helped him ease the growing ache in his chest. He'd curl onto his lap while the man typed away at his computer, creating lesson plans and such, and sleep beside him after terribly long night shifts that left the hero not only sleep-deprived but emotionally drained. But, just because he wasn't angry, didn't mean the cat wasn't being a little sheet at the moment. He meowed again, paws beginning to knead through his shirt now, claws poking and prodding at the man's chest. It clearly wanted something, and the man gave a heavy eye roll at the needy get it and quite annoying action. He sat up, watching as the cat took a small tumble on the bed and rolled a few inches away, where it sprung up and gave a meaningless hiss at Aizawa, more annoyed than anything. "Oh come on, I thought cats always landed on their feet?" He joked, watching as the cat's face didn't change from its angry scowl. Instead of continuing his assault, the cat instead hopped off the bed and began prancing away, tail in the air and head held high. He did stop at the door and gave an impatient, borderline sassy meow before strutting out, leaving the tired man alone in the bedroom with two choices: attempt the impossible task of sleeping or follow the blasted cat. It took the man a few seconds before he blew out a frustrated breath, rolling his eyes at his pet's antics, before making his decision. "Jesus, I'm coming you but whole," Aizawa muttered, flinging the sheets off his body and throwing his legs over the side of the bed. He stifled a yawn when he stood, then turned to a nearby chair and snatched his got flashy yellow sweatshirt, pulling it on over his black V-neck, before beginning the pursuit of his demanding pet into the main hallway. After taking his first few steps, it became very apparent that his legs and feet ached. He recalled patrol last night had gone on longer than intended and his body wasn't used to running and jumping for almost 9 hours, so the muscles in his legs were not very pleased with him to say the least. He found himself curling and uncurling his toes as he made it out of his bedroom door and into the hallway that led to the living room and kitchen, trying to relieve the tightness in his muscles. There was another meow, and the hero lifted his head to see the black cat standing delicately on the counter, paws shifting back and forth against the white marble countertop. Once his attention was on the thing, it started walking in circles around a small metal food bowl, green eyes catching Shota's every few laps. "You're such a drama queen," he mumbled, rolling his eyes. It had been a week prior that he'd found the mangy thing roaming the streets alone. Naturally, Aizawa had given it a small piece of cat food he always kept on hands for strays, but that cat had followed him all the way home and snuck into the house. Since then, Aizawa and Hizashi had made a mutual agreement to keep the cat, though they hadn't made one on his name. Aizawa wanted to name him Yatsu, while Hizashi told him if he got kept the cat he couldn't simultaneously insult it. For now, he'd have to settle for names like butthole, BSRD, drama queen, and other insults until they found a suitable name. The cat, not entirely fond of his previous statement, slammed his paw down onto the food bowl. It caused a ricochet of banging as the bowl did its thing, the wobble of metal against stone echoing throughout the house so sharply it gave him a headache. That was unnecessary, he pointed out, making his way to the cabinet where they kept the cat food in and pulling out a can of wet food. I'm serious, that was a petty and cheap move. Next time, go find a bird to kill or something. He muttered lamely, using the tab to pull open the can and placed the food into his metal bowl. The cat stared at the food, then back at Aizawa, giving a small meow, before digging in. Yeah, whatever. He waved the cat off, sluggishly making his way to the trash can and discarding the remains of the can. He felt himself give another yawn, and realized making a cup or two of coffee would make his day slightly more bearable. He could practically feel the circles beginning to build under his eyes, and he knew working such long shifts so often was both unnecessary and self-damaging, but he needed to keep busy. And without his husband, that was difficult. He opened the cupboard, lifting his head and reaching for the bag of coffee beans. And his hand conveniently slipped through air. You're joking. He placed his hand further onto the shelf, patting around the area and trying to find the one thing keeping him from having an absolute mental breakdown, only to find nothing. He was completely out of the beans of gold, his will to live dwindling with every given strike. He felt his hands clench slightly, and it took everything in him to keep himself from losing his cool. He inhaled once, exhaled once, and opened his eyes. Fine, if he couldn't make coffee, he'd just buy one and some beans on his way back. He was pretty sure they needed more milk and eggs anyways, so it wouldn't be a complete waste of gas. He made his way over to his apartment door, shuffling into his boots with a grunt. So far, this day was just getting better and better, was all he thought as he bitterly exited the house and made his way to the car. The following contains heavy depictions of violence, abuse, and other displeasing topics read at your own discretion. Izuku Midoriya had been having a sheet day though. In all honesty, it had been a sheet few years. But today had been brutal. For starters, he was locked in cage, body twisted uncomfortably in a thing that shouldn't be able to fit an 11-year-old boy inside. Yet somehow, his malnourished bones and short height let his dad throw him in there with ease. His voice was raw from screaming and fingertips bloody from fighting against the thin metal in futile attempts at escaping. He'd made plenty of dents in the thing, yet the bars still managed to hold just enough that he couldn't break through. Everything hurt, purple bruises on his arms and a blossoming one on his cheekbone, but the pain was nothing compared to the absolute fear and anxiety he felt within the cage. Currently, he had his knees pulled to his chest and his body pressed as far away from the entrance as possible. He'd cried so much his head hurt, the ache behind his burning eyes making it almost impossible to sprout any more crocodile tears, as his father called them. He wasn't sobbing anymore. Instead, he was pulling at his hair and trying to keep the pit in his stomach from spreading throughout his body. So, like he said, a sheet day. The door to the basement opened, and the way Izuku jumped made the cage rattle, lock hitting the bars and making a resounding noise that made Izuku want to cover his ears. His eyes met his father's shady figure, large hands, broad shoulders, crazy black hair, and in his hand he held a belt. The boy felt himself shrink further into the cage, head bowed and eyes focused forward. Midoriya, Midoriya, Midoriya. His voice dragged through Midoriya's brain like the screeching of car tires or the crack of a gun, unpleasant and absolutely terrifying. The boy was gripping onto the skin of his arms tightly, fingernails surely drawing blood. You worthless effing brat. To most kids, the words might actually hurt, might sink so deep into their skin that tears might actually be a byproduct of them. Not Izuku, no, in this case, the boy just took the words and listened. They didn't sink into his skin, they were his skin. He lived underneath the words his father threw at him, tore down what once could have been a promising and bright child, and built it up to make an empty shell of a nothing. He had nothing if not the insults and bruises, so the words didn't affect him. They barely even scratched the surface of some of the things he'd been called. You're like a disease. You burden and weaken everything around you. He got closer, his feet stopping right outside the cage before he dropped down into a squat, crazy eyes staring at him in the darkness. Izuku didn't know how drunk or high he was, how much he'd downed during his time spent in the cage, but if he was anything like he was the day previous, Izuku would rather die than have to live through that again. Izuku dropped his eyes to the floor, avoiding his father's piercing gaze, before something shook the cage from the outside, causing the entire thing to rattle and throw Izuku off balance. He fell forward, using his arms to break his fall as he let out a quiet wince, though it barely made it past his lips before the noise was drowned out. "Look at me when I speak, you little sheet." The sudden raise in volume had Izuku quickly snapping his gaze upwards, eyes meeting his father's once again, so he could tell he was paying attention. "That's better, looks like you're not terrible at following directions after all." He sneered, before reaching into his pocket and producing something shiny and small, metallic gold shining in the poor lighting. The key. Izuku felt his heart rate increase, from both anticipation to get himself out of the tight spot, as well as fear from what would happen when he did leave. "Would you like out now, Midoriya?" The man taunted, waving the key out of reach, teasing and tormenting the poor boy. Izuku hesitantly nodded, lips sealed and eyes wide as he watched the man glare. "I asked you a FING question, respond with a verbal answer, you freak." His hands curled around the key, hiding it from sight, and Izuku pulled himself up. I'm sorry, don't leave me here dash," he rasped, voice uneven and throat sore. Please, let me go." He pleaded, eyed shinning as he brought himself forward. The man responded with a grunt, slowly unwrapping his fingers from around the key and tilting his head mockingly. "You're such a pathetic excuse for a human, you know that, right?" He jabbed, before slowly and purposefully gripping the lock and inserting the key inside, twisting until a faint click could be heard. Almost instantly, Izuku sagged in relief, watching his father slowly open the door and, unsurprisingly, reach into the cage to yank Izuku out by his hair. The boy hissed in pain, feeling a burning sensation rip through his scalp as he was pulled out and thrown forward. He skidded against the cement floor, knees knocking painfully to the hard surface and wrists scraping uselessly. He felt himself collapse in exhaustion, but at least he could breathe again, no longer feeling like the walls were closing in on every side. Before he could register what was happening, he heard the snap of a belt and pain shot through his entire upper back, body tensing and constricting as agony lit him practically on fire. He cried out, covering the back of his head with his arms as he waited for the next hit, instinctively curling in on himself like a pill bug. What he didn't expect was for booming laughter to follow instead of another hit. It caused him to peek through his fingers in surprise, squinting through uncurled fists and trying to anticipate what was coming next. "You're so weak, you know you're like FNG bug," he pointed out, crouching down and taking my jaw into his hands, causing the boy to flinch backwards and whimper. He felt as the man jerked his head side to side, like he was inspecting an object to see what its worth was. "You're so pathetic, a disgusting creature to look at really. Skinny, pale, sunken, sickly, frail, and just wrong-looking." He insulted, eyes scanning over the body of a boy who didn't take care of himself, who couldn't take care of himself. "You're unlovable." Izuku flinched at the words, but he didn't dare take his eyes away from his father. Fear was spreading through his body, adrenaline shooting through his veins like ice. He clenched his fists tightly, his jaw locked and body rigid and tight as he tried to anticipate what would happen next. His jaw was dropped harshly, and the sudden movement caused the boy's head to fall to the ground, hitting the hard floor with a crack and causing him to blink away stars. He rolled over in pain, turning so he wasn't facing his dad anymore and making a move to get up. The world was spinning heavily, shifting around with every small amount of movement the boy made, and it took him a while before he could even pull himself to his hands and knees, shaking from exhaustion and anxiety. "Get up," his dad growled, and Izuku had to push down the growing vomit that was rising in his throat and stagger shakily to his feet. It felt weird, standing up straight for the first time in hours, and the child found himself wobbling and aching as he did. Before he even had himself balanced, his collar was grabbed and he was slammed against the wall behind him. It knocked the wind out of him and he gasped desperately for air, diaphragm contracting weakly in his stomach as he choked on absolutely nothing. It burned, like oxygen was being consumed but not put to use. He felt himself gasp but nothing really entered his lungs. He felt himself breath but air never trickled in. It was horrible, the wheezing mixed with the pain, and he felt tears brim in his eyes before he could stop them. His dad gave a cold laugh, eyes cold and distant as whatever alcohol he drank or drag he took intoxicated him. I could see the way his eyes moved erratically, and everything in Izuku was screaming to fight. His jaw clenched, fists curling and body seizing as his breath returned to him, air finally filling his lungs. But, just as the sweet relief of air had come, his father sought to take it from him, with the hands that wrapped tightly around his neck. And Izuku panicked. His heart was thumping so loudly he could hear it in his ears, his mind had lost all rational thoughts, the world slipping away until it was just the two of them. Black clouded his vision and he knew this was it. If he didn't do something right then and there, if he didn't move, he was going to die. The thought of dying like this, at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect him, scared the shit out of him. Almost instinctively, his body acting on its own accord of self-preservation, his knee raised as harshly as possible and connected with his father's gut, the sound of his father coughing and gagging was what followed, and Izuku felt the hands around his throat drop. It wasn't like how they explain in books and movies, there was no slow motion effect, Izuku's father wasn't knocked out in a single blow, and the world didn't show him a way to fight the man without getting hurt. No, this wasn't a game where the hero fought and bravely defeated the villain. This was Izuku's life. And in that story, Izuku Midoriya did something he'd never thought of doing in his entire life. He ran. His legs moved swiftly, body carrying him up the flight of stairs noisily as his dad screamed his name after him. It was lost in the movement though. Once he made it out the basement door, he was running for the exit, a flimsy white door that was just through the kitchen. He didn't hesitate or stop to do a shoulder check when he reached the end of the stairs. He kept running. Every bone in his body was yelling at him to stop, to just give up and let his dad beat the life and fight out of him, but when his eyes locked on the kitchen door, Izuku ran faster. His hands reached the door handle, slim bony fingers wrapping around cool metal, and he pushed down hard while simultaneously slamming into it with his body. The door gave way, and the small boy was thrown forward from the sheer momentum. He stumbled, catching his feet quickly as the sound of his dad pursuing him continued, giving him no time to rest. His legs picked up speed, red shoes hitting the cement with a loud slapping noise while his hair whipped backwards, revealing the bruises across his face. He didn't slow down when he reached the road, body turning sharply as he kept pumping both his arms and legs. Everything hurt. He shouldn't even be able to run at this point. He should be sobbing in pain and clutching his racing heart and lungs, but his brain just wouldn't give. He rounded a corner, not looking where he was going as he made his way into what he thought was another empty street, and not checking his surroundings seemed to be his greatest downfall, because just as quickly as he had been running forwards, he was knocked backwards as he ran into a big soft sweatshirt. He fell backwards, body inches from the pavement just as hands reached out and caught at his arms, preventing the fall but sending waves of pain up his shoulders and wrists. What the hell? A gruff and stern voice cursed, and as Izuku's eyes went up, the stranger's eyes went down, resting on the boy's mop of crazy green hair. Dark eyes widened, surveying his obviously disheveled, panicked, and injured appearance. Almost instantly, he went cold, body still high and pumped with adrenaline. He began to move, a sense of dread beginning to take over. The tired-looking adult looked more awake now, and began to slowly lower himself to the younger boy's level. "Kid, what's wrong?" The strange man with dark hair asked as Izuku struggled irrationally in his grasp, gaze wide and fearful. He kept glancing behind him, checking to see if his dad was still on his tail, wondering how long he had until he was found. The words were coming out of his mouth in broken babbles. He could barely keep himself from crying and his entire body ached with pain. "Please, I need go." He gasped desperately, body moving frantically and weakly in an attempt to free himself. Izuku felt the man make a move to steady his shaking shoulders, but that only caused him to struggle more urgently. Izuku could tell he was worried, but all the poor boy could think in his mind was how screwed he would be if his dad caught up to him. "Kid, look at me." The voice was calm, not demanding or angry, and he found himself slowly stopping his movements and turning his gaze to look the stranger in the eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I need you to tell me what's wrong so I can help," he urged, and Izuku began inching closer to the person, his panic beginning to subside and turn into relief. The word caused him to once again remember how dire the situation he was in was, and his next words came out shaky and anxious. He made eye contact with him, blinking back tears, and spoke. "I did. He's coming, he's going to dash." But the boy never got to finish his sentence as the sound of heavy footsteps coming around the corner cut him off. The sound of a man behind him caused the false sense of security, of safety, to crumble in a mere second. There you are, Izuku. A hero without a cape. There were moments in Izuku's life where his body would become completely still, like he'd been hit with some sort of paralysis quirk that wouldn't let him move, times where he's wanted to do something like throw a punch or scream or run, but his body seemed completely out of his control. His limbs would feel like lead and his legs like they were rooted to the ground so deeply it would take an entire excavation team to move him from his place. Meanwhile, his brain would be screaming at him so loudly he could barely focus on everything around him, because all he was thinking was do something. This was one of those moments. "My dear Izuku, where are you going?" The chill down his spine from the words caused his hands to tremble and his eyes to tear up, but otherwise, he was frozen. A statue of terror and regret that could not be thawed. "Come on, don't be scared, the man is gone. I promise it's only father, you're safe." His lies twisted around Izuku, wrapping around his throat and squeezing just enough that the boy could barely breathe, and Izuku found anxiety stir in his stomach. He was helpless. This man was going to leave him, his father was going to take him home, he was going to die a slow, painful death and no one but his parents would know. And he still couldn't get himself to move. He watched through clouded eyes as the stranger in front of him creased his brows, eyes flicking over the many bruises and injuries that painted the boy's face like it was a canvas before they looked behind him at his father's figure. Izuku waited for the words, anticipating the words, "Glad to see his father found him, I'll take my leave now," but they never came. What happened to him? These injuries look severe. He questioned instead, gentle hands running over the cracked knuckles on Izuku's hands before trailing upwards to examine the scars across his arm, eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of them as he waited for Izuku's father to answer. The man in question seemed to take a step forward. Izuku could hear the small patter against the pavement over the beating of his heart, his feet itching to move closer to the stranger and further from his father. "We were walking back from the market, picking up food so his mother could cook." His mother hadn't cooked a meal in 7 years, not for him at least. "When we came across a man and his friend, both looked suspicious, so I tried to lead him away from the area, but then they took Izuku and ran." He tried to think of a time when his dad had led him away from danger, and his mind comes up blank. "Nothing. I tried to catch them, but they disappeared for a while. I finally saw the flash of green as Izuku rounded this corner, and knew I had found him. His dad made him sick, this whole situation made him sick, everything made him feel like he was going to throw up. Thank you for finding my son, sir, it's such a relief." And at that moment, a large hand landed on his shoulder, the weight of it throwing Izuku's senses into overdrive. He felt every muscle in his body tighten, all of his blood suddenly was moving, his arms could bend and his fingers could curl, and he felt like he could move again. It was like having cold water draped over him, an avalanche of feelings finally hitting him, and all that built-up panic from the mental rope that tethered him to his father broke free, and Izuku leapt forward, latching onto the mystery man like he was his only light to salvation. Arms tangling around his neck and gripping his hoodie while he buried his face into his chest weakly. He didn't care if the stranger was shocked, or if his father was angered, because this was his last shot. This was the only thing he could do for himself, and he had to hope it was enough. As he thought, the man beneath him let out a surprised grunt, hands spread wide in shock, and Izuku waited for him to shove the boy off. He tensed, anticipating that his body would hit the harsh concrete, held his breath for a hand to the face or an elbow to the chest. But again he was wrong. A gentle arm wrapped loosely and comfortingly against his back, while a free cradled the boy's head against him, soft hair probably tickling the man's fingers. Izuku didn't flinch, and the tensed muscles in his body suddenly let go of whatever they were holding onto as he kept the man within his grasp, breathing shaky and uneven. He felt small strands of black hair tickle his clammy hands and the slow rumble underneath him as the stranger spoke his next words. "Not all of these injuries are recent. Izuku could feel the weight of the words, and his grip on the man became a little tighter while his lip began to tremble ever so slightly. So that story doesn't make sense. He didn't seem to leave room for argument, his voice hitting a tone that sounded almost threatening. His father seemed to pick up on it himself, as the scruff of his shoes moving further away from the pair could be heard. There was a long stretch of silence, in which Izuku could feel his body trembling and could hear every time his eyes opened or closed. It was a stressful silence, the kind that meant his father was thinking, crafting an explanation that would fit the narrative and the proof and explain why he was lying in the first place. He's a clumsy kid, always falling over. He's quirkless too, got extra joints in his toes, leaves him off balance. He said curtly, and the words were like daggers, aimed directly at Izuku's heart. The edges twisted painfully in his chest, a sort of pain that wasn't explainable running through his body as he realized the intentions behind what he was saying. It wasn't a solid explanation, but he was laying it on the table so the bystander was aware because there was always a chance, an extremely large chance, that when the word quirkless was thrown into conversation, suddenly, Izuku Midoriya's safety was no longer relevant. And that terrified him. So much so he began shaking within the man's arms, voice coming out broken as he whispered so softly, "Don't let go." The arm around his waist tightened instantly, curling protectively around him in a way that not only assured Izuku the man wasn't planning on letting him go, but made him feel all the more secure. Like when you clicked a seat belt into the buckle at the start of a car ride. I would highly advise you take a step away from the child. It wasn't really a suggestion from what Izuku could gather, the tone having an edge that to most people probably sounded terrifying. At the lack of movement, the man continued. Now. The scruff of shoes backing away never came however, and soon his father's voice rang out clear as day. Izuku, let go of him. He felt so incredibly useless, so incredibly small, so incredibly worthless. It was like all the fight suddenly left him at the sound of his father's voice, because the many what-ifs that flew through his head would have been enough to fill a small book. He couldn't breathe suddenly, and the grip he had around his savior slowly slackened. Maybe if he was good. Maybe if he listened. Then, he felt the hand holding his head and the arm around his waist give him a reassuring squeeze. The contact had him thinking again, rational thoughts beginning to run back into his head as he froze his surrender. Don't speak to the child, speak to me. The man snapped, obviously losing his patience, and the next few moments were a bit of a blur. There was a sudden force that was knocking both him and the stranger over. Izuku felt his head hit the concrete painfully and let out a cry. The grip, reassuring and calm, around his body was stripped away and he suddenly had a feeling of dread as the air hit him. There was a shout, and something hit his stomach, causing him to recoil in pain and curl in on himself. A grunt sounded from behind him, then a clatter and a thump. Izuku found himself shutting his eyes tight, refusing to look at what had occurred. He was going to die. He was going to die and this stranger was going to die and everything was for nothing and it was all his fault. Hey kid, it's alright. I've got you, everything's going to be okay. Izuku's thoughts came to a screeching halt, eyes snapping open as he turned to face what he had thought to have been the murder of an innocent man. Instead, what he saw left him swallowing tightly. His father was unconscious, blood running from his nose in a steady stream. There was a knife that, he came to the conclusion quickly, his father had been holding in his pocket. It was now on the ground, reflective metal glistening in sunlight. Kneeling in front of him, lips pulled thin in concern, was the man Izuku had run into. The boy didn't know what to do, his adrenaline had brought him this far, but as soon as that was gone, Izuku met the man's face with wild eyes, fear evident within the sea of green. If he had been able to so easily put his father to waste, what would he do with Izuku? How would the poor boy be able to even try and fight back? He felt himself contemplating running as the mystery man got closer, flinching when his hands came towards him. An expression which Izuku could only describe as hurt flashed briefly in his eyes, before he retracted his hand and kneeled down across from Izuku. I won't hurt you, he assured, placing his hands in his lap as he gazed at the boy thoughtfully. He only swallowed thickly in response, eyes flicking through the scene again skittishly. I'm a pro hero, I promise you're safe now. The words had Izuku's eyes pausing their jittery movements before landing back on the man. This time he really studied him. Black hair that hung just below his shoulders, the waves making it seem shorter than it actually was, framed his face and hid a vast majority of his features. He was lean, even under the sweatshirt Izuku could tell he had muscles, and it made the sentence all the more believable. His eyes were tired and even a little bloodshot, dark iris studying Izuku like one might observe a stray animal. Apprehensive, concerned, caring. Hiro. The way he asked the question sounded like he'd never heard the word before, but of course, Izuku had. How could he not? Everything he'd ever wanted to become, everything he'd been led to believe was right, everything that his parents had thrown him into, all of it was based around the word hero. Hero, powerful, influential, strong, things he could never be because he was quirkless. The man seemed to take a step closer, holding out his hand like an olive branch, his eyes pleading for his trust. Get it here. You can call me Aizawa, okay? I'm going to dash. But Izuku never got to figure out what he was going to do, because just as he was reaching for the man's hand, a piercing pain shot up his spine and head. Like being struck by lightning, it spread through every limb in his body, effectively ending his attempt at any movement and making him close his eyes tightly, slipping into an inky black darkness that not eliminated pain, but also all his worries. His mind went completely blank, and for once in his life, he wasn't happy about it. Shota Aizawa was a hero, seeing injuries, blood, gore, pain, suffering came with the job title. You'd think after a while of watching others get hurt or sometimes die would have less effect the more you witnessed it. You'd think the wounds and blood and cries would become less intense, less scary. You'd think that all the anxiety he had when running into situations that might require him to act fast or fight would melt away because he was a hero, and heroes were meant to be used to that kind of thing. But when he tells you, his heart plummeted so far into his stomach when the too small boy ran into him with such determination to get away from whatever he was running from. The boy couldn't be older than 8 with his size. The way his skin clung to bone like there was nothing else inside of him made it impossible to tell whether or not he'd ever had a full meal. Dark circles under his eyes were crossed out with scratches and bruises, some darker than others, some more faded. His white t-shirt was torn in so many places, it was more of a rag than a clothing item, not to mention the dried blood crusted on the neckline and the sides. His hair was a mess, his eyes were wild and red, his hands were shaking and torn to shreds like he'd been punching a brick wall, his arms were scared and bruised, his legs were wobbling, and he smelled like sweat and urine. Aizawa had to fight to keep his voice reassuring, because he'd heard of cases about abuse victims, heard about police arresting perpetrators that thought domestic violence was fun, but he'd never seen such a broken-looking child in all his years of hero work. Because that was something he didn't often deal with, and it scared the shit out of him. Now, just a few moments after he'd completely debilitated the father, the boy, Izuku, had collapsed in pain and didn't look like he had any intentions of waking up anytime soon. It worried Aizawa, and as the boy collapsed he reflexively caught at his head, mess of green hair falling softly into his palms. The second he touched the boy's head, however, Aizawa felt every muscle in his body tighten. Something slick and warm dripped into his hands and coated his fingers, the liquid sending a weird feeling through his entire body. He knew it was blood before he saw the red drip on the pavement, knew it was blood before he had time to pull his hand out to check, knew it was blood despite the fact it coated his green mop. Before he knew it, he was pulling the boy gently into his arms, cradling the weight of almost nothing against him before springing up and reaching for his phone, hands shaking barely. The police station picked up on the first ring, and Shota didn't bother with formalities. No, he told them the location of the father, the condition of the son, and which hospital he was going to, as well as his hero name. Then, he hung off and started running as fast as his legs would carry him towards the nearest hospital. He didn't care that his favorite hoodie was now stained red, that his hands were coated in the same dark substance, or that the boy had effectively caused him to miss picking up coffee and food. None of that mattered. All that mattered was the condition the boy was in, and how far Aizawa would go to keep him alive. Hospital beds hold no warmth. Aizawa was very acutely aware of the beeping beside him, and the silence that took place between the noise. He's aware that only hours ago a team of doctors and nurses were helping heal the kid's head, using quirks to close the wound instead of stitches so they didn't need to shave tufts of green. He's aware that they'd been cringing at every injury, from the belt buckle marks on his back to the carefully placed burns across his abdomen, branding the child like he was a wild animal. He's aware he'd had to avert his eyes when he saw the words carved into the boy's arms, feeling his stomach churn at the thought of what his muffled screams might have sounded like when they'd been inflicted on his skin. He's aware that at some point, he'd been asked to step outside while they finished helping him. He's so incredibly aware, and as selfish as it may sound, he wished he didn't have to be. Now, the boy's breathing was shallow at best, short inhales of air flowing through dry lips, and light exhales following. Aizawa was watching his tiny chest rise and fall, bones barely poking through the white and blue hospital gown as he filled his lungs up, before letting them fall down. The gown was the smallest they could find without it being too short, yet it still hung so loosely against his small skinny figure. Most of his injuries had been healed with quirks, lash marks, second-degree burns, split knuckles, gashes, and hairline fractures, but all the healing had taken a lot out of the kid and he'd been sleeping for the past 13 hours. Aizawa didn't blame him. Based on the dark circles under his eyes, the boy's sleep schedule was just as bad as his own, and that feat was something no one should be proud of. It had taken the man a while to pull himself back into reality as he stared at the boy, wondering how something like this could happen to someone who looked so young. He was struggling with the weight of knowing the kid was going to have to wake up to find someone he didn't know sitting next to his bed, watching him like a hawk, and wondering if the breath he saw would be the last one. It took him everything and anything to realize he actually needed to do something instead of just sit and watch the boy sleep. So, instead of simply watching, he had made the choice of dialing his husband's phone number. The other hero had been scheduled to return very late tonight, or early depending on who you talk to, and Aizawa had cancelled all his hero work for both tonight and the next 3 days hoping he could spend a little much-needed time with the loud blonde. However, now he was wondering if he'd even be able to leave the boy's side until, at the very least, he woke up. And even then, the man didn't want to leave him alone. Hizashi Yamada answered on the second ring. "Sho. What's up?" It was like all the tension holding Aizawa's muscles taut had disappeared, leaving him feeling even the slightest bit better. He let himself lay back a little, hoping his voice didn't sound as tired as he felt. A lot. Actually, he glanced at the boy, eyes drifting to his sleeping figure. Shota had always thought of sleeping to be a relaxing sort of event, but he couldn't help but see the tension between the kid's eyebrows and jaw, like a certain thought still managed to pull his body taut even as he rested. "There's quite a bit that's up. How's your work been?" He wanted to talk more with his husband before he dropped this on him, wanted to have 1 second of nothing before he had to focus on the something. There was a small sound of shifting on the other end, before Mick's voice made it through once again, his tone a touch softer than before. "It went well, case was solved and we didn't have any causalities, luckily. On the flip side, I lost my hearing aids and had to wear the extras we bought ages ago. I'll probably take him out when I'm back, you know? So be prepared to do some sign." His lips curled upwards in a slight smile, knowing Hizashi hated wearing his hearing aids even when they were comfortable. "I don't really mind, you seem to prefer sign to hearing aids anyway." His voice definitely sounded tired, he could tell from the way his words barely stayed clear and the weird tone they took on. "I'm glad your mission went well." It was clear to both parties that the man was stalling at this point, his voice almost unrecognizable. "Me too." His tone was growing even softer now, no longer bright and positive, even bordering on what the man would dare call a bit concerned. "Shota, what's wrong? You called for something, right, not just small talk." There it was, the golden question, and Aizawa felt himself run a hand down his face before sighing, not knowing exactly how to put it. There wasn't exactly one way to tell his husband everything that had happened, because what had happened wasn't just a simple walk in the park. It was horrible and deep and made him wish the man was here in person so he could crawl into his arms and stay there forever. "Yeah, you're right." He took a glance at the boy, the sound of the heart rate monitor now becoming louder than before. "I'm calling from the hospital." The sharp intake of breath on the other end had Aizawa immediately regretting the words. The way he phrased them sounded like he was the one injured or dying. Hero work did that, and he could almost hear the panic through the phone as Hizashi spoke next. What happened? Why are you in the hospital? Show dash. I'm fine, Zashi. Physically at least. He cringed outwardly, feeling his eyes slip closed as he explained. It's not me I'm here for. I was off duty today, we were out of coffee so I went out to buy some and dash. His breath hitched ever so slightly as he remembered the boy running into him, wide eyes and slim figure fighting weakly against his ginger hold. This kid, can't be older than 9, ran into me. Good. He was so beaten. I could see the bones in his wrists and face, and he was terrified of something. His father came around the corner quickly and it was like he was looking death in the eyes and mortified by what he saw. It hurt to describe, and he felt like he was on the sidewalk all over again, unable to fix what had been so clearly shattered. Worst came to worst and he tried to attack the kid and me, didn't do much but. He couldn't help but dig his nails into the back of his neck, just behind his hair, feeling the light sting bring him back to focus. The kid was hurt, and he's in the hospital now and I can't leave him dash. Hey show, it's okay. It was like his husband could sense the anxiety attack building in his chest, like he was there and could see him spiraling. After I land I'll catch a cab to the. Which hospital are you at? Muzutafu emerge. The question had panic quickly leaking out of him at the implication of his words. Shota felt his eyes widen and his grip on the phone slip just barely. He was at Muzutafu Emergency. It had been the closest hospital from where they were and he'd ran mindlessly towards it with the weak kid in his arms, but from the airport it had to be at least an hour drive, not to mention it was 15 minutes from their apartment. He'd have to get in a cab after flying all day, just to be dropped off at a hospital filled with both minor injuries and extreme cases, no chance of sleeping in his own warm bed which he'd been away from for 5 days. You don't have to, you've been traveling all day, Hizashi dash. Shota, what hospital are you at? His voice wasn't frustrated, more so stern, implying the hero really didn't have a say in where he went and when, and if he wanted to spend his first night back holding his disheveled husband in a hospital room, he was going to. Aizawa didn't bother trying to convince him to worry about himself, fight leaving him quicker than normal. Maybe it was the fact he hadn't slept more than 5 hours in the past 5 days, or that he was currently touch-starved for his husband, but just as quick as he had been to argue against the man coming, he was eating his words and relaying the hospital's name in absolute defeat. Muzutafu Emergency. Do you want me to bring anything? No. I'll be there as quick as I can be, which probably won't be for a few hours. Okay. And that was that. Izuku Midoriya was fighting to open his eyes, battling against the weights that begged him to keep them closed and trying his best to blink them open. He'd been struggling for the past few seconds, the sting in behind his lids making it increasingly difficult to do anything at all. Okay. A voice. Midoriya had heard that voice before. He felt his breath hitching ever so slightly and he almost exhaled in relief knowing he had control over his lungs. So he was conscious, just not awake yet. Or maybe he was awake and his eyes were just refusing to cooperate. Maybe he was just too tired to do anything at all. That scared him, because he'd never been so tired he'd been unable to face the world with open eyes. Sure, there'd been days where school wasn't just a grueling task but a downright punishment, leaving him broken before he could even face his father, and by the end of everything he hadn't wanted to wake up. But that was different. Back then he'd wanted to stay asleep and never wake because waking up felt like he would repeat the same thing on loop. But now he felt like he needed to open his eyes. There was an urgency behind everything, so he began to fight harder, pushing and pulling at whatever forces had him in this black abyss. Are you sure? The voice still sounded like it was underwater, and Izuku forced himself to keep pushing, following the sound like one might follow the sunset. He felt his hands clench in a fabric. It was so unnoticeable he almost couldn't feel it, but the harder he squeezed the more he could understand what it felt like. It was rough and thin and most definitely provided no warmth. He was aware he was cold, goosebumps running up his arms which were bare. He felt his hands squeeze tighter. The clothes he wore were not his torn old cloths. They were cheaper and cleaner and held no comfort. He could feel it end at his knees and elbows and felt himself try and wiggle his toes. Try and have a good flight. He felt his foot move an inch to the left and a wave of victory settled through his bones. It was like he was about to break the surface, the weight holding his eyelids down getting lighter and lighter, and suddenly, the force dropped altogether. His eyes shot open once, harsh light causing him to blink repeatedly, and he let out one small groan that came out as more of a whimper. He could hear the faint sound of a heart monitor and voices outside the hall. People were yelling and there was no comfort within the white room. It was strictly medical, clean, empty, holding no love or warmth at all. Hizashi, I have to go. Izuku's eyes instantly snapped to the sound of the voice, feeling his body tense in response. Love you too. The phone the man was holding to his ear dropped, and dark, exhausted, worried eyes met his own. He scrunched his nose up a little, trying to decide if he knew the man from somewhere because he looked awfully familiar. Things came back to him in bits and pieces as he studied the figure before him. He remembered the cage, a belt, screaming, a big white door, running, crashing, shaking, yelling, comfort, panic, and darkness. He drew his brows together, hearing his heart increase slightly as things began to make sense. It was still foggy, like he was replaying the events with a snowstorm over top of everything, but he got enough. He remembered enough. This man was a hero. This man had saved him. This man was someone he wanted to trust. This man had asked to be called Aizawa. This man was safe. Hey Izuku, right? That's your name. Aizawa made sure to keep his distance, hands gently placed on the spot beside Izuku's arms so he wasn't quite touching him, but was still close enough that he could feel his presence. The question processed through the boy's brain slowly, but when he opened his mouth to speak, nothing came out. It wasn't that he couldn't speak, he realized, because if he really tried hard he could. He just didn't want to. It had always been like this. Izuku had a fear of speaking up. Maybe it was from being told to shut up or laughed at whenever he spoke, but speaking made him really anxious if he thought about it long enough. He remembered when he was younger, they'd had a class on hand motions, and the boy had asked the instructor if he could learn more. He soaked the language up quickly, and it made him feel so much better than speaking at first. Then he'd showed his father, and Izuku bit his lip, willing himself not to go back there, trying really hard not to listen as the memory of his father yelling at him to toughen up replayed in his head. He wanted to claw at his skin and rip out his throat so he'd have an excuse not to feel this way ever again. He always felt uncomfortable. He always hated himself. He always wished he was just normal. Izuku was well aware the man before him was waiting for an answer to his question, so he swallowed the thick feeling in his throat and gave a short nod. Nodding isn't weird, right? Normal kids nod. Normal kids would answer the question. That's a good name, Izuku. A really good name. Do you remember my name? Aizawa asked. The man's words were slow and clear, intent on keeping his voice kind and secure. It was the way his teachers talked to the other kids when they fell down or felt sad. It was the way his peers' parents spoke to them when it was time to be picked up. It was a way no one had ever spoken to Izuku. It felt like the man wasn't aware he was a nothing. It unraveled knots within his stomach, while constricting his heart at the same time, because he wasn't used to being talked to like this. He wanted the man to speak to him this way forever, never figuring out the truth. He was just a worthless brat. Izuku bit his lip, feeling himself nod in response to the question, meeting Aizawa's kind eyes with a fearful gaze. Aizawa! The words were so small, his father probably would have screamed at him for sounding so weak, but he couldn't force them a decibel louder. He waited for the man to respond, wondering if he'd need to repeat himself to get the words heard. That's right. All right, Izuku, do you know where you are? He took a glance around the room. He'd never been here before, and it was quite blank. There seemed to be weird tools and machines all around him, some strapped to him, others attached to the bed he was laying in, the noises coming from him both annoying and unfamiliar. He tilted his head while examining everything, really wanting to know the right answer so he might seem competent. But no answer came to mind, so he simply shook his head. That's okay, kid. We're at Muzudafu Emergency. It's a hospital. Do you know what that is? Aizawa questioned him, eyes never straying from Izuku's small frame. He felt himself lull the word over in his mind, vaguely remembering his parents mentioning a hospital. Or maybe it was his teacher. Like a light bulb going off in his head, His eyes widened. They'd read a book in class about a little girl who'd gone to the hospital because she was sick with a sickness Izuku couldn't pronounce if he tried. He remembered that her hospital had the same white walls and blank machines, though he did remember her hospital bed had get well soon cards beside it. Izuku didn't bother looking for a card he knew wouldn't be there. It's a place where sick people go to get healthy. Izuku looked at the man for confirmation, hoping his answer might please him. Judging by the sudden shift in his expression, a short and kind smile tugging at his lips, he wasn't upset by it. Izuku had never made someone else smile before, unless they were laughing at his expense, so watching the man's lips twist briefly had a little light stirring within his stomach. Correct. He started, though Izuku had a feeling Aizawa wasn't quite finished talking yet. It can be for sick people, but it also helps people who get hurt. That's why you're here, Izuku, because you got hurt. His eyes and voice took a somber tone, and the boy felt like it might have been his fault. He was hurt after all, that's why he was here wasting this man's time. His father would have. His thoughts came to a halt, and he realized his father wasn't here. For once in his life, his father wasn't leering over his shoulder threateningly, no one was hurting him, and it felt so wrong. His body wasn't aching, his mind wasn't spinning, there weren't any cuts, bruises, scrapes, or broken bones, and it didn't feel normal. His fists tightened around the thin sheets around him, and he waited for the man's next words. Izuku, do you remember how you got hurt? But he couldn't force the words through his lips. Do you think you might be able to tell me what happened? I want to help you, kid, but I need to know what steps to take first. Izuku swallowed thickly, the words catching in his throat like someone had thrown a wall between his vocal cords and his lips. He tried to take a breath in, tried to remember what had happened that led to the cage and the door and the man, because this stranger, Aizawa, who Izuku didn't know that well, wanted to help him. He knew he was quirkless, he knew his father hit him, and he still wanted to help him. He stuttered nervously. I was late. The words formed dully in his brain as he spoke, filtering the truth and the lies as he tried hard to remember and see through a fog. I came from school late, and father and mother weren't happy with me. He squinted in concentration, like he was putting pieces of a puzzle together, seeing each individual part slot into its position. They hurt me, he finally admitted before locking eyes with Aizawa. So I ran. Sometimes, Izuku would close his eyes and pretend he was somewhere completely different, like in the storybooks his elementary school teachers used to read to him when he couldn't make out the kanjis. He liked to picture a lovely grass field with pretty white flowers that smelt like honey, blue skies and cotton candy clouds. The air would be warm and the sun bright, and he would feel nothing. There wasn't any pain or suffering, and he didn't have to acknowledge anything that was happening. But right now, Izuku was more present than he ever could have imagined. He wasn't pretending to be in a warm, cozy, green grass field. He was trying to remember everything he'd gone through so he could tell the detective who was coming to work on his case any minute now. It was so weird, trying to grasp at things he'd done his best to block out, sift through memories that were foggy and broken. In all honesty, he would rather forget everything that happened and never think about it again. But Aizawa, the man Izuku had been trying his best to trust, told him that this detective was going to help him keep his father away forever and make sure he was safe from here on out. No more pain? He'd questioned with a head tilt of almost confusion. He'd watched the man make a face that bordered on horrified, before schooling his expression with an exhale and an extremely forced, almost sad, smile. No more pain. He'd repeated for confirmation. Now Izuku was regretting his decision. He could hear his heart rate monitor accelerating the more he thought how absolutely horrible this idea was. How could he be sure this wouldn't just anger his father more? How could he be positive that this was the right choice? What if this man wanted to hurt him too? Izuku, kid, is everything all right? He hadn't even heard the door open, his entire body tensing at the sudden sound of Aizawa's voice. He wasn't scared of Aizawa like he was scared of his father. That fear was different. This fear was more of a fear of the unknown, like he couldn't predict what his next move could be, couldn't analyze his expressions or thoughts or words. And that seemed to terrify him. He didn't answer the question, not trusting himself to say that no, nothing was all right and he wasn't sure if it ever would be. He hadn't been able to finish his lunch, he hadn't been able to drink all his water, he had barely been able to let the doctors give him a short physical exam without Aizawa present, and now he wasn't sure he'd be able to talk to the detective. There was a sigh, and Izuku felt the bed dip as Aizawa slowly lowered himself onto the corner, careful not to sit on Izuku's thin legs. You can tell me if you don't want to talk to Naomasa. I won't be upset, this is up to you. But he will help you, kid. He's going to make sure things get better, does that make sense? Izuku could feel himself tense more, because despite Aizawa assuring him he wouldn't be upset, Izuku could sense disappointment in his gaze, and he instantly felt like he failed him. Even thinking about backing out felt criminal, like he was doing something wrong. He was always doing something wrong. His heart rate picked up speed and suddenly he couldn't breathe. His vision went weird and his throat closed and he felt everything in him move quicker than before. He could feel his heart jumping out of his chest, see how the panic was affecting the way everything looked, knew something wasn't right. But he couldn't stop it. Pain gripped at his chest and he felt himself begin to slip further and further into the panicky abyss. The heart rate monitor was beeping like crazy now, and the noise around him wasn't doing much to help the way he felt. He kept his tears from flowing, reluctantly shutting his eyes and covering his ears before curling into a ball. He didn't want to exist anymore. He didn't want to feel anymore. He wanted his heart rate to stop beating, his mind to stop reeling, his thoughts to stop thinking, his body to stop moving, his world to stop spinning. A hand came down gently on his shoulder and he flinched so violently he almost fell off the bed. Sobs racked free of his lips, and he cried against the thin sheets of the hospital bed, pleading for safety and mercy, shaking and trembling so badly he couldn't pull himself to look at who had dared to touch him. When the hand came down on his shoulder again, he sobbed harder. "Stop touching me! Get off! No!" He cried, desperately cried, clawing at the sheets with trembling hands like he was trying to dig himself deeper into the sheets. He just wanted to disappear into nothing. He just wanted to stop feeling. Somebody please. Izuku Midoriya wanted the world to stop hurting him, so then maybe he could feel like he wasn't disappointing everyone. Aizawa Shoyuda had watched as Izuku began to panic. From the second he had walked into the room from getting lunch, he knew something was off. It had escalated quickly, and Aizawa had done his best to keep his distance unless asked to come closer. The nurse on call, however, didn't share his common sense. Before he could so much as speak a word to help calm Izuku down, he'd been shushed and shoved aside, for an older woman to take his place and gently place he had on his shoulder. Aizawa knew what was going to happen before her hand came down, and he couldn't stop before she had the poor kid flinching backwards and almost falling off the bed. "Don't dash," he tried to warn again, before she was moving forward and tugging him back by the same shoulder. It wasn't until his feeble cries and pleads for her to let him go came that Aizawa stepped in, placing a firm hand on the nurse's shoulder and tugging her back. She stumbled, and her hands on the kid released instantly. He stopped screaming, whimpering and covering his face instead while he shook violently. He could feel his heart break in his chest, little pieces scattering throughout him and getting lost as it slowly came apart. "You're making it worse." Aizawa deadpanned, stepping in front of Izuku and ignoring the nurse's cold and deadly glare, settling to sit tenderly beside Izuku with careful care not to touch him. "Kid, can you hear me?" he asked, and watched as Izuku gave a hesitant nod in return. It was so small and terrified that Aizawa wasn't even sure he'd seen it, but he didn't have time to analyze and calculate the probability of him being right. "Okay, that's good. Really good. You're doing really good, Izuku. You hear that? So good," he assured firmly, watching as the tension in the boy's shoulders seemed to loosen ever so slightly. "And not good. Disappointing. Sorry." He choked out, words ever so slightly forced through gasps in his breath. Aizawa wanted to give him a hug, throw him in a bundle of blankets and keep him warm and safe forever. But he knew it would be a long while before he could even consider touching him without verbal consent. "You're wrong. You being here and eating, even if it's not the entire meal, that's a good thing. You ate food and it made you feel better, and that makes me feel better. No one is upset or disappointed, kiddo. I'm proud that you even considered the detective or the food or letting me help you. I'm so proud of you, Izuku. Do you hear that? You're doing good and I'm going to help you do even better because you deserve to be happy. The man doesn't hesitate or eat his words. He simply watches the boy come out of his shell slowly with every affirmation. And he watches as the boy creeps closer and closer until his small figure is kneeling directly in front of Aizawa. He's got his small frail hands held tightly in front of him, red eyes staring hesitantly up at the hero, mess of hair sticking up and dirty, and shaking form still letting a few tears slip from his eyes. I want to help you, Izuku. I want to make sure you're safe. You deserve everything and anything. Understand? He explained and watched in absolute awe as small hands slowly reached forward, flinching back as he came in light contact with Aizawa's waist, breathing out shakily and unsteadily before drawing his eyebrows together and slowly wrapping his hands around Aizawa's middle. He let out a few stray sobs, really trying to keep his emotions hidden within the yellow of Aizawa's sweater, before ultimately keeping his entire face buried in the warmth of the man's sweater. Aizawa doesn't hesitate to wrap his own arms around Izuku protectively, sighing in relief as he finally allows himself to accept the fact he's in this for as long as he can be. Izuku was holding Aizawa's hand like his life depended on it, the scary and quite touchy nurse from before being completely removed from the situation. He'd been able to breathe for the past half hour, and he was sure his eyes were no longer red and bloodshot. He still felt sick to his stomach, like at any moment all of the food he'd been trying to keep down would suddenly come up and he'd be forced to endure the familiar feeling of his esophagus burning as bile burned his throat. But when Aizawa held his hand tightly and firmly, the boy didn't feel quite so sick. Izuku, the detective is just outside the room right now. Aizawa starts, his voice calm, reassuring, but the words send a spike of anxiety through Izuku's entire soul regardless. Thoughts reeling yet again as he let himself begin to spiral. But he won't come in until you tell me to let him in. Understand? Your choice, kid. If you aren't feeling up to it tonight, we don't have to. Tonight, that made Izuku realize just how late it was. He didn't know how to read a clock, so the ticking one in the corner of his room didn't make much sense to him, but he could tell from the darkness coming through the window it had to be past 10 at the least. That meant all these doctors, nurses, detectives, and people here taking care of him were out of their houses and wasting their time on him. And this detective was outside, waiting to ask Izuku deeply personal questions to help him out. And he wanted to send him away because he was nervous, because he couldn't handle facing the fact that what happened to him was wrong and deserved to be punished. Izuku felt himself swallow thick liquid in the back of his throat as a fresh wave of nausea rolled over him, realizing there was no way out of this. So, with a hesitant glance at Aizawa, he exhaled and nodded. It's okay. It'll be okay. Aizawa let his lips tip up, giving Izuku a look he'd never seen anyone give him before. It was comforting and sweet, and it reminded the boy of the way the sun felt on your skin when you were wearing a t-shirt. Good job, kid. I'm really proud and this is a big step forward. He gave Izuku's hand a gentle squeeze, but considering the death grip the boy already had on the exhausted-looking man, it didn't make much of a difference. Tsukachi, you can come in. And as the door opened, Izuku didn't move an inch. His back stiffened, posture going rigid and face going pale, because this man was someone Izuku wasn't sure he could trust, despite Aizawa assuring him he meant Izuku no harm. He had black hair, and by the looks of it, that was freshly trimmed and cut. He wore a white-collared shirt Izuku had seen his father wear during social events the Midoriyas would host, events that always resulted in something Izuku did not want or like. He wore a blue tie and beige breathes, and held a strange device Izuku had never ever seen in his life. Hello there. His voice was calm and low, trying not to scare off Izuku. He still flinched nonetheless. Bad people spoke softly too. I'm Detective Tsukachi Naomesa. I'm going to be asking you a few questions. Izuku stared at him for a second, lips sealed, before looking at Aizawa, eyes conveying a look that said he wanted permission to speak. It caused the hero to startle slightly, eyebrows furrowing and lips thinning, before he gave a light nod. You don't have to ask to speak, Izuku. His words lulled over in the boy's mind, causing him to nod and give Tsukachi a hesitant look. Tsukachi. He spoke timidly, eyes darting across the detective's body. Okay. Tsukachi seemed pleased by his response, and slowly moved to sit on the chair opposite to where Aizawa sat. He held the fancy machine in his hand, before clicking a button and placing it on the bed. The date is August 13th, XXXX. Local time in Mizudafu is 12:48 a.m. This is Detective Tsukachi interviewing the boy for the eraser head case. My quirk allows me to detect whether or not someone is being honest or telling a lie, and I will be using it on the individual named. He looked at Izuku with a smile, and at being put on the spot he could hear his heart rate monitor beep a little faster. Aizawa. He choked on his last name, eyes blowing wide as he tried to keep himself from throwing up. Take a breath, calm yourself, and answer. He swallowed back any anxiety and forced the answer out. Izuku Midoriya. It was like his name physically caused him pain. Saying the last name out loud was an excruciating task, because it reminded him that he would forever be his father's. Nothing more than a little boy who tried too hard to please a man who didn't try enough to accept him. Good job. He heard Aizawa say, and felt the light squeeze of his hand around Izuku's own trebling fingers. He could do this. He had to do this. He needed to do this. No one else could do this. Breathe. True. Izuku Midoriya is his name. The detective supplied for confirmation, before he turned to look directly at Izuku. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer them as honestly as possible. It wasn't like Izuku could lie. If what this man said was true, he'd need to know exactly the extent of this man's quirk in order to fully comprehend how to successfully lie. But he wasn't going to lie to someone who wanted to help him. All right, Izuku, can you tell me how old you are? It was a simple question, and Izuku found himself sitting up a little as he answered it. 11. He spoke confidently, hoping he'd counted the days right. But the second the answer flew past his lips, he heard Eraserhead draw in a sharp take of breath, like he was shocked. Izuku did suppose he might have been short for his age, but he couldn't look too young. Could it? True. Okay, how about what your quirk is? The detective seemed to think this question might get Izuku to open up a bit, share something personal and trackable with him because so many kids at age 11 just love to talk about their quirks. But Izuku visibly found himself reel back at the question, gripping Aizawa's hand tightly, because this question caused an ache in his chest and a tremble in his fingers. He didn't really want to do this anymore, and he hadn't even discussed what had happened to him. He started, faltering a bit as he looked down, shameful. I'm quirkless. I don't have one. He said, closing his eyes and waiting for the detective's reaction. He was used to people grinning ear to ear, because quirkless people were the perfect targets for hate crimes and assault, or people outright looking at him like he was nothing more than dirt on the soles of their feet. True. Izuku, did growing up quirkless cause a lot of problems for you? Socially? How does your friend group look? The questions asked caused the boy to bite his lip, not really knowing how to answer that. But it does. It makes a lot of people not like me. He answers, brows furrowing. I don't do anything wrong, I guess that's the problem. I don't do anything, I'm plain and pathetic. People don't hang out with me because they're scared they might become plain and pathetic like me. I don't have friends, only bullies. He explained, watching Tsukachi now like a hawk, wanting to understand how his own quirk worked. All true. What school do you go to, currently? Masagaki Primary. I'm at my last year there. He responded quickly, since that was a question he didn't really need to think on. He'd spent more than enough time learning the name of his school so he could tell bus drivers and taxis where a kid of his age was heading alone. True. Izuku, I'm going to ask you about the events that took place before you ran into a race, Aizawa. This was it. Now Izuku had to spill everything and anything he knew. He could feel his anxiety spike, but he didn't say anything. Just stared blankly at the detective and waited for his question. Who was chasing you when you ran into Aizawa? Izuku swallowed, closing his eyes and turning to look at the hero who saved him, wanting to pay attention to how he reacted more than anyone else. My father was chasing me. True. Izuku, can I ask why you were running from your father? He tried to. Izuku fumbled with his thoughts, each coherent sentence going to his lips and evaporating into thin air. Just speak, damn it. He cursed himself out, twisting his hand in Aizawa's nervously. He was going to kill me. So I ran. There was a long stretch of silence, and during that time, Izuku could feel Aizawa shift closer to him, feeling the heat as his body moved ever so slightly closer to his own. It felt comforting, knowing someone was right there if the boy really needed something. True. What happened prior to his attempt to kill you? Could you try and explain why he was in such a state? It sounded almost accusatory, and the boy felt tears build in the corners of his eyes. Maybe this was all his fault. Maybe he shouldn't have played death and ran. Maybe he should have just died. I came home late from school a few days ago. Izuku whispered, loud enough that everyone could hear him. He wasn't gone like usual, and I came home late and he was so angry. Izuku bowed his head as a few silent tears slipped out of his eyes. I begged him not to, even tried to fight him, but he brought out his belt and he hit me really hard on the back of my head over and over and dash. His voice cracked as he broke off, lip trembling as he tried to force the rest of the story out. I woke up in a dog cage in the basement. I remember screaming and yelling and begging to be let out, but he just ignored me, or if I got too loud he put me in this muzzle. He would come down sometimes and just poke me with a piece of metal. He tried to fight the nausea rolling within him, but found himself simply holding his stomach with his free hand instead. When he finally let me out, he threw me into the wall and hit me with the belt, and then he tried to choke me and I got up and ran. The story came tumbling past his lips, the grip on his hand tightening as he went through the events of what had happened with his father. I'm sorry. The apology came out choked, and he was sorry. He was sorry he dragged a detective out of his home and more important work to come interview him 45 minutes past midnight. He was sorry that Aizawa wouldn't be able to do whatever he'd planned to do tonight because of him. He was sorry that the hospital staff had used their time and energy and resources to heal wounds that wouldn't ever really close, but what he was really sorry for was living. Because if he had just died, no one would have known or cared. This wouldn't have happened. He didn't deserve to feel relief. He didn't deserve anything. True. Came the involuntary and necessary noise of Tsukachi's quirk. At the same time Aizawa spoke. Kid, you don't need to apologize. None of this is your fault, I promise you. He reassured him, and though the words didn't completely erase his guilt, they did lessen it. If only by a slight amount. Enough that he was confident enough to move a little closer to Aizawa, almost hiding next to him. If anyone in the room noticed, they didn't say anything. The only changes was a tightening in the grip upon his hand. Izuku, is this the first time he's done something like this to you? The detective asked, leaning forward slightly as he spoke as if he was trying to gauge Izuku's facial expressions, though it seemed counterproductive considering his quirk did most of the analyzing for him. No. Izuku swallowed, free hand resting on his thigh beginning to scratch lightly at the exposed skin. He felt the sharp sting of pain as his nails dug into the freshly healed skin, wondering if old scratch scars still remained. He didn't look, not wanting to attract any attention to the area. He just needed a distraction, if only for a second. True. I hate to ask, but might you explain previous incidents of abuse? Strictly physical. The detective spoke gently, but the words still rubbed against Izuku's ears like sandpaper. He didn't want to think about anything other than the fact that this was supposed to offer him help. This was a good thing. He was meant to be happy that the detective wanted to offer his quirk and skills for Izuku's well-being. And yet, it felt like more of a punishment or form of mental torture than anything. There was this time he used his quirk to brand my stomach. It's fire breathing. And he placed his mouth over my abdomen and lit it on fire. The scar beneath the hospital gown itched, pink, dry, skin making my stomach swirl. He didn't want to explain why he was branded, so he made a decision to leave it out unless he was asked. He threw me into things a lot. I think I have a mark on my collarbone from where the bones snapped through the skin because he threw me down the basement stairs. I think I passed out after it happened, because when I woke up, it wasn't out of my skin anymore. I think he put it back in place, but the wound was still there, so I had to dress and wrap it, and it scarred. Hesitantly, he unlatched his free hand from his leg and pulled the hospital gown's collar away from his throat, revealing a thin and jagged-looking pink scar. Do you need more? Izuku questioned, feeling his hands and fingers begin to tremble. He was surprised he hadn't panicked yet, even more surprised that he had yet to shed a tear. True. No, that should be enough to cover that topic. I just have a few more questions. Izuku, the detective, slowly moved to rub at his tired eyes, before looking at the kid with a serious expression. Have you been a victim to SXL abuse in your household? And the question left Izuku speechless, like all the air in the room was pulled out of his reach. He didn't move, didn't react, and felt his false bravery begin to crumble, piece by piece chipping away as the question rang in his head. He could feel the room tense at his hesitation to answer, the air growing thick and hot and wrong. No. For a split second, Izuku thought that lying might actually save him. Thought even with his hesitation they would have to believe him, because he was just a kid and surely that would be enough to convince them he hadn't been through something like that. Surely he would get away with it. Surely the man sitting in front of him didn't have a quirk that could and would detect any lie he spoke. Lie. The words brought Izuku crashing to reality, and the nausea and the panic he'd been keeping at bay returned. Heart racing, hands sweating, stomach twisting, and world shaking, he didn't know what he was meant to do. It felt wrong, because he should have been able to say no and move on and pretend none of the bad things that ever happened to him happened. He should be able to lie and ignore the fact he was abused in such a painstakingly horrible way. He should have the right to keep his past concealed, but he had no way to do that. A small drop of wetness ran down his cheek, tickling his skin and baiting his body to continue to let this ache in his bones move on. No. He trembled, letting go of the hand Aizawa held him with and recoiling away from both the detective and the kind man. He glued his lips shut as he tried to keep bile down, covering his mouth with one hand and wrapping his free one around his center. He wished he was dead. He wanted to be dead. Why wasn't he dead? Kid, I'm sorry but I have to ask again. I need verbal confirmation, Izuku. Have you been a victim to SXL abuse? Please answer truthfully. Tiny, pathetic, empty, soul-crushing, world-ending, pitiful sobs racked his rib cage and body. He turned his head into the pillow beneath him and curled in on himself. He felt so disgusting and wrong, and as he closed his eyes, he snapped them open, choking on his tears as a sudden and painful flashback hit him. He could hear the man beside him, feel his small and cold fingers. Izuku didn't want to answer the question, but he didn't have a choice. Crying and sniffling and pathetically trying to calm himself down alone, he locked eyes with the detective. Yes. He breathed, and there was a sound of silence before. Truth. Izuku didn't want to think anymore. It took a while to calm Izuku down after that, and Aizawa did his best to make sure he felt safe and secure, even offering up his prized yellow hoodie after he saw the boy shivering from the hospital's much-too-cold climate. Tsukachi had asked few questions after that, simple yes or no's like, was your father the one? To which Izuku had told him it was his father's friend. Or, did it happen more than once? And Izuku had simply said no. After that, Tsukachi asked Aizawa to speak with him in the hall, which they were currently in the process of doing. This is a lot. Aizawa breathed, pinching his nose and keeping his voice as quiet as possible as he spoke, making sure Izuku wouldn't hear them. The last thing he wanted was the poor boy thinking he was exhausting Shota. Even if this was an extremely emotionally and mentally draining task. I understand, Aizawa, this case definitely isn't going to end without scars. The detective glanced at his device, eyes burning holes into the small thing. However, I need to question you about what you plan to do next. His voice was strangely calm considering what had just gone down, but Aizawa didn't bother to mention it. He was a detective and had surely seen worse cases. Elaborate. He ordered, slightly confused by the question. The detective took a small breath, glancing at passerbys and making sure no one was eavesdropping before talking. The boy is going to need a place to stay. I need to know if you'll continue to care for him, or if I should be contacting an orphanage within the area. I'm not suggesting you take him in, but I don't believe someone of his mental and emotional state should be around an orphanage. Not to mention he's quirkless, which introduces an entire other string of problems for him when it comes to meeting other kids his age. Tsukachi explained simply, eyeing Shota up and down quickly before stepping back and letting the exhausted man process this information. He blinked a few times, registering what the man was saying before sighing. I don't know, Tsukachi. I'd have to talk with Hizashi, and even then. He glanced at the room, picturing the boy's broken heart as he was forced to separate himself from Aizawa. He couldn't deny he'd grown slightly protective of the child in the short time having met him, but that didn't mean he knew the first thing about raising a kid, let alone one that held more trauma than anyone should have to handle. I'd need to give it time. But for now, I'll agree for temporary custody until I can work out something more permanent. He decided, exhaling the words while his eyes stayed glued to the hospital door. Tsukachi nodded once, then, being a man of few words, turned and walked away, leaving Aizawa standing there alone and drained, before heading back to Izuku's room, sitting on the bed beside him, and letting the small boy slowly lay his head on his shoulder. He didn't know who fell asleep first, but soon, both of them were snoring lightly. Aizawa pried his eyes open as the door to his room opened. The weight of someone else, someone much too small to be Hizashi, startled him into looking down only to find a tuft of green and soft, relaxed snores. The feeling that spread through the man's chest at the sight of Izuku curled safely against him, face no longer pinched in worry or unease, was a feeling like no other. It was warm, and it filled his chest like how coffee filled his stomach, warming him up from the inside and causing a shiver to run down his spine. He didn't dare move, fear of waking the sleeping angel in his arms, settling his eyes on whoever had just entered the door. And he almost cried in relief at the sight of his husband, carrying not only his yellow weighted blanket, but 2 hot coffees and a charming smile. Shota didn't know how he managed to do it, get here so quickly with so much energy and happiness, after working for almost a week straight on his own, but the second he laid eyes upon him all rational thoughts dissipated. He was staring at his lord and Defenji savior, and Hizashi seemed to sense that as he placed the items down and approached Aizawa quickly, embracing him tightly and warmly. Shota didn't cry, he told himself as something wet blurred his vision. Because he would not break down yet, not after holding his composure together for so long. He blinked away tears instead, and buried his exhaustion deep into Hizashi's shoulder. He exhaled and inhaled, the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon enveloping his senses almost instantly. He let the feeling of Mike and only Mike fill him with relief. He let the sound of his heartbeat steady his racing thoughts. He let the arms draped around him serve as an anchor before he could float away, and he let this man help him. If only for a second. If only for a short PRD. If only until he needed to pull away. If only until it ended. Sho, Hizashi said, running a slender hand through his dark hair, and Aizawa didn't put up any fight, he just let him. He didn't make a grunt of fake protest or twist his face, he just let the feeling of someone loving him warm his soul. Because he realized how lucky he was to have that, after spending only a few hours with a boy who'd never experienced love in his life. A long stretch of silence overtook them, before Aizawa forced himself away from his husband to rub gently at his eyes, reminding himself that he'd forgotten to bring his eye drops completely. Maybe the hospital staff had some too. Before he could even think, a Hizashi was waving a white bottle right under his nose, face bright and eyes holding a glint. I know you said not to grab anything, but I found this on your dresser. His voice held its usual tone, and for the first time he began remembering their previous conversation. Aizawa glanced at his ears, only to find much too small. Hearing aids shoved onto the things messily. He winced at the sight, reaching a hand up to cup the man's cheek and bring him closer so he could fix it. You didn't have to wear these. Shota spoke for the first time, hand brushing over the irritated area and practically feeling the wince that Hizashi let out. These weren't uncomfortable, these were painful. He wanted to rip them off his husband's ears, but he wasn't going to do that without discussing it with him first. There was a pause as the other man, albeit gently, grasped Shota's hand and pried it away from his inflamed ear. The little listener probably wants me to be able to hear him, at least Shota. I don't want to scare him away now, do I? It made his heart break slightly, knowing the man didn't even know who this kid was and was still willing to go through the strain of wearing poor hearing aids. Shaking his head, Aizawa drew his brows together. You won't scare him, Hizashi. Jesus, your ears are bright red, you should take them out, if only for a break. He insisted, trying to reason with his husband and get the demed things out of his ears. Maybe they'd be accidentally misplaced in the next few minutes, or fall out the window, or into the trash can. Maybe. There was a second of silence from the other man, before he reluctantly reached upwards and began untangling the hearing aids from his skin. Shota was quick to help, hands nimbly guiding him along and helping remove any particularly irritated bits. When all was done, 2 small brown hearing aids sat alone on the table. Aizawa could see Hizashi's shoulders slump in relief a little, yet those death traps were not going back on his husband. "How does it feel?" Aizawa signed, watching the man read his hands before responding, somewhat thoughtfully, himself. "Better," was Hizashi's simple sign back, the bright glint in his eyes ever the more present as he obviously exhaled in relief. Shota looked at the hearing aids which now rested in the palm of the loud blonde's hands, eyeing them with a certain sort of distaste. He carefully and calmly watched the blonde curl his fist around them, before sticking them in his pocket with a grunt. Aizawa said nothing, keeping his hands still and his gaze as even as it could be as he looked at his husband and waited for something, anything, to happen. Because if there was one thing Shota Aizawa was never able to do, it was start a conversation. His social skills barely beat that of a pet rock, and his ability to understand cues within social situations was almost entirely inept. Ever since he and Hizashi had started dating, the other had almost always planned social events, sparked conversation, or eased stress when it came to people. Hizashi put his hands out, and Aizawa's attention immediately and gratefully snapped to the movements his hands made. "How is he? The boy? He looks exhausted." The man signed slowly, eyes gazing to the bundle of green underneath thin white hospital cheeks that folded stiffly around his fragile body. His eyes were shut softly, lashes dusting the bottom of his cheekbones, and his lips parted to make way for fresh air. He had a fist curled in the pillow beside him, and both legs drawn up to his chest so he was curled in a fetal-like position making him look small and meek. "He's..." Shota's hands paused momentarily. Seemed too mundane to describe what this kid had been through and tired, to simple. Traumatized. He decided, hands moving through the air shakily as he signed the words out. Hizashi seems to nod, coming closer to sit on the edge of the bed and stare at the small kid in front of him. He looks so young, too young. The man is gazing over the boy with green hair like Aizawa did when he first saw him, studying every small injury and movement like he was a ticking time bomb about to detonate. There was analyzation of all the scars and marks, and how he kept himself curled tightly together as if he was holding every broken piece together with his own hands. Shota raises his hands to sign and give a more accurate description of the events that took place. He's severely malnourished, they're putting him on a meal plan to help gain back some more strength, but right now, his body is eating itself to stay alive. He starts off, making sure his husband is paying attention before continuing. Doctors and nurses said he's broken and healed bones incorrectly. They had to go through surgery to correct some of them more accurately with their quirks when we first arrived. His father had been abusing him for what looks like years, and he has scars to show for it. Aizawa gives his hands a break, letting them drop to his side as he anxiously stares at the green boy, wondering how many years exactly this had become a regular occurrence. Picking up his hands, he continues. "We had him speak with Tsukachi. Not only did he experience physical abuse, but also SXL. The latter says in a harsh breath, blue eyes flicking in panic to the tiny boy curled in a tiny bed. He's just a kid." The man's hands move in a panic and Aizawa gives a nod. How could someone even think of? He looked sick, eyes shut in absolute distress, and Shota moved himself closer to lay a hand on the latter's arm. It didn't take long for Hizashi to calm himself, but the amount of pain the situation seemed to put his husband in was hard to watch. Just a kid, and yet, he had endured what most adults would never even need to worry about. He needs somewhere to stay after he gets cleared from the hospital. Shota starts slowly, watching his husband pick apart every word and put the puzzle pieces together. "I have temporary emergency custody right now, but dash." Hands wrapped around his own, and Aizawa looked up slowly to meet Hizashi's bright green eyes which held a sense of hope in them. "Sho, you know I've wanted a listener of my own." It's rare for Hizashi to speak without hearing aids, and though his tone is slightly unbalanced, his expression paves a clear way for what his words mean. The sight causes all rational thoughts flowing through Aizawa's head to come to a complete halt. Because his pride and joy, his husband, is glancing between him and Izuku like it's some miracle. Shota doesn't free his hands to mention they were both new at parenting, that the boy needed to agree, or the fact that this was going to probably take a lot more than simply just saying the words yes. No, he doesn't keep his rational and calm side because for once, the man wants to follow what the Dmed organ inside his chest is ordering him to do. He wants to do something that makes him happy and not thin about the future consequences. He wants to take care of Izuku Midoriya, and he doesn't care if it's illogical or stupid, because that boy has never been shown support or care, and if Aizawa can be the one to offer a hand, maybe Izuku might get a taste of what a childhood should feel like. And right now, that's enough for Shota. When Izuku woke up, he found himself noticing a person he had never seen before, fast asleep with Aizawa on the ground. Izuku took a moment to study him, blonde hair that fell way past his shoulders, glasses that had started falling off from sleep, and pastel purple hoodie that read had a white cat playing the guitar in the center. His legs were spread out wide on the floor, mouth slightly agape, while he laid his head on top of Aizawa's. The man he recognized had his nose nestled in the crook of Mystery Man's neck, knees pulled to his chest and eyes shut in a relaxed position. Izuku sort of sat there for a second, studying the two with a curious gaze because they looked so comfortable. Izuku couldn't imagine how laying on the cold hospital floor with no pillows or blankets could make you look that comfortable, that at peace, that safe. He didn't know how you could feel that happy when you weren't even laying down, because he knew for a fact sleeping upright was not comfortable. He watched the dark-haired man give a light shiver, body shifting gently as he nestled himself further into the blonde, and that's when Izuku realized he hadn't remembered to give Aizawa back his yellow hoodie. The warm cloth was still draped over Izuku's body. Selfishly, he was glad the man had yet to take back the fluffy sweater. It was warm and soft and everything Izuku had never realized clothing could be, and instantly the thought caused guilt to stir in his stomach. It wasn't like he could give back the sweater. He really didn't want to wake the drained-looking man up after all he'd been through tonight, but looking around the room and at his own bed, Izuku had a bright idea. He bit his lip, urging his crunchy and rough hospital sheets to keep quiet as he slowly crawled from his bed, short feet hitting the ground soundlessly. He was quite good at being sneaky, a skill he'd quickly picked up after kindergarten came and went. He found he needed to be quieter, softer, slower, and overall just less noticeable. So, naturally, he had practiced how to creep and crawl around. Not that it had really mattered, people still seemed to have it out for him. He maneuvered his way past all the expensive beeping equipment, making sure he kept the small piece of plastic attached to his finger hooked up. The last thing he wanted was for it to flatline because he accidentally disconnected it. That would defiantly wake everyone up, and one of the kind nurses had explained that to him when he first woke up. Once he was at the foot of the bed, he slowly tore the hospital sheets from his bed off the mattress, cringing at how loudly the sheets crinkled. He threw a quick glance behind him, watching as Aizawa seemed to stir. Before he ultimately fell back into place, face a little further from sight now. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't even been aware he was holding before he took the thin sheets and bent over Aizawa and the strange man. He lightly draped the fabric over the two of them, making sure not to touch either of them as he did so. He knew very well the hospital sheet didn't do much, but it had been better than nothing, so he thought it would be nice for the two of them to have something to at least cover them. Then, once he was sure neither had woken up or looked uncomfortable, he crawled back the way he came and up onto the bed, folding his legs idly until they were crisscross. He didn't really have much to do, so he spent the next half hour counting the windows, equipment, walls, posters, colors, anything he could find really. He'd made a conscious effort to memorize every word on every poster or warning label, committing everything to his memory and keeping it there. He'd look to the ceiling and quiz himself on what words meant or how many of everything there was, and he was about to answer the question of what number of items with the color blue in them were available to the naked eye, 32 in case you were wondering, when the door to his room slowly opened and the same nurse who had explained the heart monitor to him walked in. Midoriya you dash. The boy cut him off with a finger to his lips, eyes wide and almost horrified as he took a frantic glance to Aizawa in the corner. The man stirred, but again, remained asleep, allowing the green-haired boy to let out a breath of sorts before giving a sheepish look to the nurse and pointing a shaking finger. The blue-haired man seemed to smile knowingly, grin returning to his face quickly. "I see, I'll make sure to keep my voice down, don't you worry." Somehow, even while whispering, his tone was bubbly and bright, words cheerful and lovely. Izuku didn't know if he liked it, but it sure was interesting. "I was just coming in to check on you and make sure nothing hurt too much. I'm going to give you a quick checkup, make sure your vitals are still doing fine, and then get a doctor to come use their quirk to heal you." Izuku nodded along, following what he was saying with a fair bit of skepticism. He still wasn't fully comfortable with people touching him unless it was Aizawa. The man's touch had the opposite effect of most. He didn't feel like someone was clawing at his skin when Aizawa touched him. Instead he felt peaceful. Still, that didn't mean he liked when everyone else touched him. He knew he didn't really have a choice though, so he found himself slowly move so he was sitting facing the nurse, bony ankles hanging over the edge of the bed as he mentally prepared himself for being examined. "All right, Midoriya, I'm going to start by taking the 4 out of your arm. I don't think you'll be needing it anymore." Izuku gave a worried look down at the needles currently embedded in his wrist. He didn't speak, just handed his wrist over obediently and watched as he disconnected the 4 tube from the needle, closing the end off before placing his forefingers on the needle. "This might pinch a bit." It did, but the boy gave little to no reaction of it causing him any discomfort. After all, he could handle a little pinch. "All done." The boy whispered quietly, wanting to retreat back to the end of the bed he'd been in before. This nurse wasn't mean or anything, it just made Izuku feel uncomfortable and different. He preferred when he was a little further out of reach. It was better that way. The nurse smiled softly, adjusting a few things on the 4 bag before pushing it to the corner and shaking his head. "Not quite, Midoriya. I still need to do a physical examination of your older wounds and scars. Then the doctor will come in and use her quirk to fix you." Izuku didn't like the idea of someone fixing him. His entire life, he'd been told he was broken, a boy with no quirk and no friends, and in need of someone to change him. He knew the man meant physically, to heal him, and yet, he still wanted to inch further and further from the doctor. Slowly, he watched the doctor reach out towards his hospital gown and begin pulling the side of the gown and sweater away from his collarbones. And the second his skin touched Izuku's, the boy was flinching backwards so violently he knocked a tray of tools over with his foot, sending it to the floor with a resounding crash, metal hitting the floor and causing every single pair of eyes in the room to look at him, including the pair that had been sleeping silently only moments ago. Instantly, Izuku was holding in tears, hands shaking as he mumbled a string of frantic apologies, clambering off the bed despite the nurse saying it was okay and to sit still, as he shakily began to pick up tools and equipment. He could barely hear the sound of someone telling him not to touch anything over the pounding of blood in his ears as he bent down to pick up the first tool, a hand grabbing at his wrist and another on his lower back that caused him to let out whimper and a shout, body shaking further. "Don't touch me, stop, don't dash." He felt his heart rate quicken and tried to pry his hands out of the nurse's grip only to stumble backwards the second he was released. He fell backwards into the wall, head hitting the white with a little bang that sent pain up Izuku's spine. He felt his eyes widen and his breathing catch, and everything was on fire, everything was burning, everyone was crowded around him trying to touch him. He covered his ears with his hands and shut his eyes tightly, muttering the words, "No," on repeat, slowly getting louder and more frantic, because what was he supposed to do? He made a mistake and he tried to fix the mistake by cleaning it up, but that was wrong. He'd woken up Aizawa and his friend and he couldn't fix that with another flimsy blanket or pillow. He'd made everyone upset and angry and he just wanted to fix what he did wrong, but he just kept doing wrong. Why couldn't he just be right? Izuku, kid, can you hear me?" The voice was groggy, quite obviously still adjusting to the events that were transpiring, but they were still clear and firm. Izuku wanted to open his mouth to speak, but his jaw was shut tightly and he feared if he opened it he might start sobbing. He didn't want to start crying, he was much too old for tears. He'd shed much too many tears. He needed to be older and better and right. He nodded instead. keeping all his thoughts and feelings in his throat and chest. Okay, I need you to breathe, kid. You're going to pass out if you don't breathe. Izuku didn't want to pass out, but he didn't want to breathe either, because if he opened his mouth and the air came rushing in, it would also need to come rushing out. He settled for small, hitched breathes through his nose, keeping his lips together. Aizawa didn't get mad. The entire time Izuku panicked, he didn't get frustrated or upset or angry at the fact he didn't want to open his mouth. The man didn't touch him until Izuku reached a hand forward and squeezed his, then he hesitantly pulled the boy into a hug and ran a gentle, comforting hand through his hair. Izuku didn't fall asleep, but he didn't stay awake. He just kind of laid there on the floor in Aizawa's arms after everything got better. His lips were parted now, and the tears had come and go like the seasons, but he still couldn't bring himself to move. Are you okay if I move us to sit on the bed? He didn't know how long they had sat on the floor, but when the tired voice of Shota Aizawa poked through his thoughts, everything he'd been ignoring slipped back into consciousness. He felt the ache in the back of his head and the sting behind his eyes. He heard the pounding of his heart in his ears and the clatter of tools going against a tray in clean-up efforts, saw the bright aching lights and 2 pairs of feet turned away from them in an attempt to give the illusion of privacy. Izuku let out a strangled noise, nodding his head before speaking, guiltily. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to, it was an accident. I'm sorry, He spoke as the man easily lifted him onto the bed, setting him down in the same position he'd been in before, except this time Aizawa was crouched down with his one hand on Izuku's knee and the other on the ground as he gave him a strong and reassuring look. It's okay, you didn't do anything wrong. You're not in trouble, kid. Aizawa spoke honestly, keeping his hand on the kid's knee while his other made a slow movement to wipe the stray tear that had fallen down Izuku's face with his thumb. The boy found it hard to believe he'd made a mess, woken the 2 men up, and hadn't listened to a word anyone was saying after that. I should be. He whispered slowly, eyes blinking in confusion as he looked from the nurse, to the blonde, and back to Aizawa. I messed up. He muttered again, bowing his head in shame as he spoke. I deserve to be in trouble. He decided, knowing he'd gotten much fiercer punishments for much less. So, why was no one angry? Izuku, no kid, you don't deserve to be in trouble. That's not how you're. The man took a breath in before speaking. You accidentally knocked something over, that's okay. Accidents happen to everyone. I make mistakes every day. The man said kindly, his eyes showing a fierce sort of passion. We all do, it's part of being a human. And as long as you didn't intentionally knock the tray over, you didn't mean to. You just got spooked, and that's valid. Izuku didn't think anyone had ever said that to him before, because most of the time, he got blamed for every single accident, even if they weren't his own. So he just nodded, trying to pretend like he understood why he wasn't in trouble for knocking the tray over, and doing his best not to make any more mistakes. Because, even if Aizawa told Izuku he wasn't in trouble, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something terrible, and that he should have been more aware or better. Izuku should have been more right, because if he wasn't wrong, this wouldn't have happened. If he didn't need to be fixed, this wouldn't have happened. If he wasn't defective, none of this would have happened. Nothing would have happened. Nothing at all. It took Izuku and Aizawa a few hours to get through the physical examination, which mainly consisted of Aizawa being the one to touch the boy when it was necessary in areas he wouldn't let the nurse or doctor even come near. Once the doctor had used her quirk and they'd made sure Izuku was stable, the 2 had told Izuku, the blonde, and Aizawa that the boy would be free to go from the hospital within the next few hours. Which led to Izuku wondering where the hell he was supposed to go. He'd sat, staring at the sheetless bed, for what seemed like an eternity, mind thinking of all the places he was going to have to deal with now that he was out of his dad's care. Foster system, orphanages, moving, meeting new people. Kid, I don't think I introduced you to Hizashi. The name made Izuku squint his eyes, green meeting green as he gave a fearful gaze in who he assumed was Hizashi's direction. He didn't want to think of how similar the name was to that of his father, but he couldn't help but draw the connection between the 2. It caused a large and irrational ache to run through Izuku's chest, but it passed when the blonde in question finally spoke. Hey little listener. I'm Hizashi Yamada. It's nice to meet you. Izuku's brows drew together, the man's tone seemed a little flat, like he couldn't hear the way he sounded completely. It didn't bother the younger boy, just made him a little curious. He gazed him up and down, taking note of the fact the man seemed to like the color purple, before resting on his ears, which were a worrisome color of red. He tried not to let the thoughts pull him backwards though, as this man seemed nice like Aizawa. He steeled himself, digesting his anxiety, before speaking. I'm Izuku. He introduced, avoiding his last name on purpose. What are you doing here? Are you another detective? He asked, wondering what the man was in his room for. Hizashi's eyebrows drew together, and he watched him tug at Aizawa's elbow. Instantly, the man's hands were in the air and they were forming words Izuku could understand from years ago. He asked why you were here. They were the fancy hand movements, the one he was told not to use ever. And this man was using them instead of hearing. Izuku looked frantically up at the bright red ears, remembered the tone of his voice, and now the hand signals. Izuku raised his own hands, mentally scraping his mind to review a language he hadn't used in almost 9 years. You can't hear me? He let his fingers and hands move slowly, the pace much sloppier and less speedy than Aizawa's, and when both pairs of eyes turned to look at him in surprise he tilted his head. What? He asked, hands still raised. He thought they'd be okay with him talking with his hands, even if his dad had called it weird and stupid. He though that because they used it he could use it. He thought he was being right for once, but maybe he was just becoming more wrong. It was like Aizawa could sense the fear of having made a mistake in his face, because the second he had felt his expression shift, the man was talking. No, we aren't upset. Just surprised, we didn't know you could sign. A weight lifted off Izuku's chest, giving him a little more breathing room. He did something good. They weren't mad. Learned when I was younger. Signed? Carefully. Didn't like talking. Used to use it. Not anymore. His sentences were short and clipped, hands not nearly as skilled or as practiced as Aizawa's, but strong and clear enough they could be read. Both men furrowed their brows together, before the blonde raised his hands to speak. Do you prefer sign? Izuku envied the way his hands moved fluidly, feeling a little disappointed he couldn't pull off the same amount of structure and clarity, before answering with a shrug. He knew it didn't answer the question, but he barely knew the answer himself. Sometimes. He decided instead, studying for the man's reaction, which only became a bright and encouraging smile. It was almost too blinding, but the conversation was cut short as a voice rung out, drawing Izuku's attention from the blonde and towards the dark-haired man in the center of the room. He moved his hands while speaking, making sure Hizashi understood. Izuku, me and Hizashi need to talk to you about something. He admitted, and the light feeling in Izuku's heart disappeared. He felt sick, his first and only thoughts being, what did he do wrong? Izuku didn't know how to feel when Aizawa told him he wanted to discuss something with him. He didn't know why he felt nervous about it or why his hands trembled slightly, but he did know whatever he wanted to speak with him about had to be serious. Otherwise, the man wouldn't have taken a seat beside him. He would have started the conversation by now. He wouldn't have made eye contact with Yamada while they exchanged an unreadable look. No, he would have been different if this was a light conversation. The silence seemed to stretch on for centuries, and Izuku felt the urge to tug at his hair growing increasingly as he waited and listened to the sound of breathing, no beeping present after the nurse had removed the device. Aizawa finally made the choice to break the silence, his words loud from the right of Izuku, while the green-haired boy simply flinched at the sudden noise. As you know, you are not going back to the place you were staying at before. Izuku took note of how Aizawa avoided using the word house or home, and he couldn't help but feel a little relieved that he wasn't being put back there. But with that being said, you'll need a place to stay for the time being. Izuku knew that. He knew he'd have to figure out his living arrangements eventually. He also knew that he had no friends or family willing to take him in, which caused his head to go straight to the first and only probable option. Are you going to place me in an orphanage? He didn't cut corners like usual, didn't say one word quizzically like he didn't want to be looked at or noticed. He spoke in full sentences, seriously, dully, and while his anxiety took a hold of his fingers instead, making them drum idly against his thigh roughly. Hizashi's eyes flickered from Aizawa's moving hands, which seemed to be translating what Izuku had said, to the green-haired boy before he spoke. That's not exactly what would happen in your scenario, kiddo. The man started, and Izuku found himself listening intently because he didn't understand his scenario at all. You'd be more likely to be put in something called foster care. Do you know what that is? Izuku bit his lip roughly before shaking his head. That's okay, little listener. Foster care is when people decide to take care of a kid whose parents have been abusive or neglectful. Do you know what that means? A nod. Alright, then you'll know that your parents haven't been doing the best job. A second nod. And that means that you'll be living with what we call a foster family. His words were nowhere as clear as Aizawa's, but they still made enough sense to Izuku that he could give a nod of confirmation and wait for further explanation. Hizashi, seemingly done his part, took a glance at the tired man and Izuku turned his attention that way. Watching as the hero heaved a small sigh, Izuku taking note of how drained he looked, and continued for his friend. Well, Izuku, with your permission, me and Hizashi would like to be your foster family for the time being. We think it would be best for you to come home with us, but before we make anything official, we thought it best to run everything by you. And Izuku could barely breath. He couldn't contain the way his heart leapt out of his chest, or how the burden placed on his shoulders lifted. It was like a tornado had passed through the first 11 years of his life, making a mess of everything and anything it could, before these two men had come and decided on their own to pick up the pieces. But he was also confused. He didn't know why. Why they wanted to be his foster family. Why they wanted to give him even so much as a second glance. Why they didn't just send him back to the house he came from and not look back. It would be so easy for them to do, so easy for them to forget, so easy for them to just pretend nothing happened like every other goddamn person on the planet. Yet they didn't. Why, what dash, he stuttered out, blinking rapidly as he tried to process the information. He felt a sudden spike of anxiety run through his chest, because what if they were wrong? What if he wasn't what they wanted? What if he was just as worthless as everyone thought and these two had no clue what they were getting into? You shouldn't want me. He spat out, curling in on himself as he rested his forehead on his knees, closing his eyes and getting his hair in his hands as he tugged. And he tugged. Tugged. It hurt, but it was enough to keep him from slipping into a panic, and that was all he could ask for as he continued breathing and listening and being as present as he could be. We do want you, kid. A gentle hand was placed on his own, and though Izuku flinched, if only momentarily, he made no move, nor had any intentions to pull away. He let cool hands envelop his own and pry them out of his hair, felt as someone rubbed soothing circled across his skin and didn't let go. Somehow, it was more grounding than the pain in his scalp, and that caused the boy to freeze, if only just for a moment. We want to take you home with us, as long as you're okay with that. But I don't want you to think we're only doing this out of pity, because we aren't. You deserve to feel happy and safe within a stable house. The man didn't sound frustrated or cross, but there was a well-disguised anguish in his words, like he was hurt by the thought Izuku didn't deserve to be happy. I want you to know that if you'd rather someone else take care of you, we are dash. No. Izuku cut him off quickly, head snapping up and mind pulling the messy strings together as he stitched a coherent thought together. It wasn't intentional or malicious, but a quick and sure answer to the original question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, sorry. He murmured, before looking between the two. Friends? Boyfriends? Husbands? Izuku couldn't tell anymore and all this guesswork had his head hurting. I meant no, I don't want to go with someone else. Sorry, but I want to go home with you. And you're? He couldn't bring himself to ask the question directly, instead deciding to allude to it with his words. Aizawa, being quite the perceptive individual, picked up on the question quickly. Husband. Hizashi is my husband. And Izuku, you don't have any reason to apologize, it's perfectly fine. I'm not mad. The man explained generously, fingers still rubbing ever so soothing circles across the back of his hand. Izuku looked at Hizashi thoughtfully, tilting his head ever so slightly, before focusing back in on Aizawa. I want to stay with you too then. He decided quickly, before opening his mouth again. Please. And he watched the instant wave of relief crash over both of their faces, all the while thinking. Maybe, for once in Izuku's life, the world had given him a good thing. And he'd be dead if he gave that thing up. Shota Aizawa, after discussing further details about what would happen when they took Izuku home, was now helping his husband understand the situation with more clarity. They'd stepped outside to talk a bit using sign, and they'd brought up the things they'd need to do to prepare for the coming weeks. We'll need to buy him proper clothing. Hizashi had signed with a sheet-eating grin that left Aizawa both annoyed and slightly amused, because only Hizashi could get so worked up over something as mundane as going shopping. He found himself fighting of a smirk, keeping his body unfazed before nodding. Yeah, and kid stuff. He said back simply, hands moving silently as he spoke. They didn't do anything else for a few seconds, just sat there, staring at each other and waiting for the other to do something. Because it seemed the reality of the situation had finally decided to make them fully aware of what they'd got themselves into. Sho. He didn't use his sign name, his hands moving to spell each individual letter of the nickname out in a way that had Aizawa's stomach turning and nodding in on itself, in both a good way and a bad. His eyebrows were dropped with a questioning look on his face, so Shota didn't bother signing to ask why he'd only said his name. Only giving a nod as if to say, continue. We're parents. We have a child. We're fathers. And now, Aizawa could barely keep the stress overtaking him at bay. His body stiffened slightly as the words resonated and hit something deep inside him. He'd taught for years, learned about teenagers and how they ran so that one day, maybe one day, he might be prepared for the horrors a child might ensue. Each time they'd left him with a headache, a room full of them for 7 hours gave him a migraine, but having one 24/7? Having an extra mouth to feed? Schooling? Clothing? Sports? Friends? It made his stomach lurch with uncertainty, because he hadn't had time to prepare, to plan, to build up the courage. But it also made something in his heart sore. It was like riding a high no one could bring him down from, because he had a boy. It wasn't his, not fully anyways, and he may only be caring for him for a few weeks or months, depending on the situation's outlook, but it still felt like he was a father. Like he was going to teach the boy things he'd joke about in the future, like he might have a chance to do things his dad never did with him. Like maybe, just maybe, not knowing what would happen next wasn't a bad thing. He raised his hands, not trembling in anxiety or excitement, just eerily still before responding. I know. Are you? He paused, brows twisting together to phrase the question in a way that might give him the answer he needed. Are you okay with that? His husband's hands hadn't lowered, so when they moved in arches and motions in front of him, a small amount of stress in his stomach loosened. Not a moment's hesitation, Hizashi was sure. I think so. I think I am. It wasn't a detailed outline like Shota's train of thoughts. No, it was a simple statement. But Aizawa had been married to husband long enough to be able to dissect the words, pick out hidden meanings behind constants and vowels, and now he had his answer. They felt the same, they were in this together, and neither planned to give in or up until they'd at least tried. Okay. Izuku had been cleared to go home 10 minutes ago, and he felt himself practically buzzing as he got out of the itchy, uncomfortable, and cold hospital room. He had to keep the gown on, bits of the seams rubbing uncomfortably against his small bare body as he climbed out of the bed, scars on full display. He didn't really notice the pair of eyes from the two men in the corner raking up and down his body in both concern and pure rage. If he did, he would have looked over and been met with them surveying all the lines and curves drawn into his skin. He had many on his arms, some long tears in the skin like someone had dragged a dull blade down from his elbow to his wrist. His collarbone had a few longer ones that disappeared under the neckline of his gown and held a blush pink to them. The most noticeable one was the branded H on the back of his neck, the top of the letter disappearing under his mop of green hair, as well as the shorter wide pink one that ran from just below his cheekbone all the way down to under his jawline. There were a mess of little ones all across his hands and legs, pink and white alike, and it was the first time anybody had really seen the damage fully. Izuku didn't know how painful they were for others to look at. All right, Mr. Midoriya, Izuku visibly cringed at the title, body tensing and hands clenching at his side in reaction. The doctor didn't seem to notice. Violet eye strained purposefully on the chart in his hand. "I think you're good to go, little one." Izuku wanted to point out he was 11, despite his height, but decided the better of it and held his tongue. "You look to be healing well, and all I have to advise you to do now is rest up and eat well to gain back a little muscle. I think your guardians will help with that though." The doctor looked at the two men in the corner pointedly, and Izuku followed his gaze. Upon realizing they were being talked to, both men offered stiff and, Izuku could have imagined it, borderline nervous nods. "Yes, we'll make sure he eats," Aizawa confirms, while the blonde, who now had pieces of brown something wedged in his vibrant red ears, bobbed his head up and down eagerly with a thumbs up. "And that he's not being too active," he adds for his husband. They share a look Izuku can't really decipher, before looking back at the boy. The doctor nods once, placing the chart back and offering a small hand towards Izuku, palm outstretched like he was asking for a high five. Izuku, scrunching his nose up, gave the hand a quick slap. The contact caused a buzz to spread through his skin, and he retracted it just as quickly as it came down, not liking the feeling of touching someone he didn't really care to know. "Yeah, we're all done," the doctor said with a smile. Izuku didn't really know what to say to that, placing his hands behind his back and shifting his shoulders so the hospital gown didn't scratch at his skin as much. He really didn't like the feeling of the hospital gown, and he did his best to keep himself from playing and shifting with it too much. Luckily, Aizawa seemed to notice this and came forward. Izuku had given him back his yellow hoodie, and the man was wearing it over top of his other clothes. He crouched down next to Izuku and very slowly reached forward to fold the edges of the gown upwards so the seams at his neckline weren't rubbing as much on his neck. He made a crease with his fingers, before lifting and adjusting the fabric again tenderly. Izuku felt a little better, and he visibly relaxed as the scratchiness went away from his neck area. "Not great, but better. Don't fret about it too much, kid. We're going to stop at a store on our way home and pick you up a pair of PJs and day clothes. We can do a more thorough trip tomorrow, when everyone a little more settled," the man explained, tucking a strand of green hair behind the boy's ears before standing up to his proper level and facing the doctor. He didn't hold out a hand to shake, or shower the cloaked man with praises like they did in the movies. No, the man simply nodded, dipping his head low and locking eyes with the man, before turning back to Izuku and holding out a hand. "Come on, kid, let's get you out of here." Izuku took the hand he was offered, and the uncomfortable buzzing sensation from the doctor's skin was instantly erased. The car ride to the apartment was quiet. No one dared disturb the silence that had fallen over the three of them with an awkward conversation. Aizawa had offered to drive instead of Hizashi, knowing the blonde was poor behind the wheel when he wasn't sleep-deprived, but the man had simply stated he drove here fine and that he could definitely drive back without any major complications. Too tired to argue, Shota had simply wordlessly helped the green-haired boy into the car. He was still a bit unsteady on his feet and the walk from his hospital room to the car had clearly worn him out, before taking his seat in the front beside his husband. A choice he was beginning to regret immensely, as the blonde gave a turn that was somehow too sharp and too long at the same time, causing Aizawa to swallow back nausea and close his eyes. "Sorry." The man spoke apologetically, though the echo that sounded through the car didn't seem to make the situation any better. Shota found himself shooting a glare in Hizashi's direction, though it lacked its usual malice and warning due to his current state of mental and physical well-being. The exhausted passenger merely heaved a small sigh before glancing back at his husband. "I told you to let me drive." He gave him a short look, not bothering to elaborate on what the sentence entailed. The latter picked up on the glance immediately, cheeks darkening intensely as he tried to muster up a smile despite the obvious embarrassment. "You look tired. I wasn't going to let you drive like that." Hizashi protested weakly, hands moving off the wheel in an attempt to gesture, before realizing he was doing a bad enough job with both hands securely attached to the part of the car that controlled direction, and slamming them back down on the leathered circle with a thump. "I always look tired," the man rebutted, blinking a few times to draw attention to his eyes as if to emphasize his point. "Not to mention the fact you spent an entire week away from home, and the day previous traveling." Why the hell did I let you drive? He muttered the last bit under his breath, slowly coming to the realization that he really hadn't given the whole driving scenario enough thought. His husband didn't seem to pick up on the last sentence, or if he did his best to ignore it, only acknowledging the two statements previous instead. Well, you looked more tired than usual then. And I spent most of the week doing paperwork, nothing strenuous. The man waved off as he took another turn, this time making Aizawa fall lightly into the window beside him. With a fed-up roll of his eyes, Aizawa let his gaze drift to the boy they'd agreed to foster, trying to divert his attention to something more productive than pointless bickering. Izuku, perched in the back, was beginning to turn the same shade as his hair, and upon seeing this, he decided it might be time to offer to change positions of seating with his husband. He was about to ask the question when the blonde suddenly slammed on the brakes, lurching Aizawa forward and causing a mass of reactions to the action to unfold. Aizawa put one hand out in front of his husband, the other hand braced tightly against the dashboard to prevent either of them from jolting too much. Izuku in the back seat seemed to make a small noise of protest as his knee slammed into the seat in front of him, and seemed to screw his eyes shut as he covered his mouth with his hands, face paling significantly more than usual, and giving the man in the passenger's seat barely enough time to respond before he was vomiting. He seemed to have curled his body in a way that would block any of the vomit from getting on the car, but that resulted in almost all of it coating his front in a vile-looking mess. It was quite watery, bits of food from lunch and breakfast that the boy had managed to keep down. He had a hand cupping a bit of it while the other was shaking in front of him. It was enough to cause Aizawa's eyes to soften from their hard glare set on Hizashi as he watched the boy give a defeated look forward. Aizawa didn't hesitate, directing Yamada to pull the car over to the side of the road, before unbuckling his seat belt and making his way over to where Izuku sat. When he opened the car door, he was met with an already crying Izuku, seemingly trying to hold back tears, as he gave Aizawa a fearful look. "I'm so sorry," he croaked out, eyes glazed and petrified. "I didn't mean to, I swear it was an accident." Aizawa crouched down to the boy's level, holding back a cringe from the awful stench the vomit gave off, and shook his head. "Kid, it's not your fault. Don't worry about it. We didn't need your hospital stuff anyways," he said kindly, reaching out and placing a hand on the boy's hair, affectionately ruffling the light, soft strands of green before pulling away and gesturing for him to get out. "But why don't you step out for a second and we can butts the damage, all right? I promise you, Izuku, we're not going to do anything to hurt you." He tried to sound reassuring, hoped he sounded comforting, and pleaded with the universe to just sound an inch like how he felt for once. To come off as anything other than the brash, emotionless, bitter, cold, and blunt man he always fronted as. He wasn't good with people. The whole reason he became an underground hero in the first place was so that the people of Japan wouldn't interact with him as much as they would a stranger off the street. There were no autographs to be had, no fans to please, no endless lines of merchandise needing to be sold with charisma, kindness, and enthusiasm. He could simply be who he wanted during the day and save lives during the night. But now, he'd gone years without even interacting with people in a way that could come off as caring or kind, and for that, he found himself to be truly ignorant. Because he should have at least practiced being soft with someone other than his husband, whom he barely interacted with enough as it was. I okay." Izuku seemed to stutter out, and though his voice was still shaky, Shota almost sighed at how his shoulders lost their tightly wired tenseness. He gave a short smile, stepping aside and watching the kid slowly and carefully slide out of the car, careful not to get any of his carefully placed vomit on the interior. It made Shota's heart ache a little. With how much more he cared about the car's well-being than his own. It caused him pain to observe, because he couldn't change it. The boy's actions were out of his control. "That's it, you're doing good," Shota said gently, placing a hand on the boy's back and helping him out of the car. The second his feet, which Shota observed with disdain, were bare, hit the pavement, he wobbled lightly. His knees shook like they were holding the weight of the world, and he felt his hands support the boy under his armpits, keeping a firm grip on him so he wouldn't fall over. "Why don't you sit down, kid? It might be easier," he asked gently, watching as Izuku's legs practically gave out at the order. He didn't hesitate, Once Izuku wasn't going to fall over, he was reaching into the car to grab the roll of paper towel he kept under the seat. Ever since Hizashi had spilt a mass amount of Sprite in the passenger's seat, the man had felt a strange need to keep the roll of white cloth in his car. He felt almost grateful for the incident now, if only because he had it at the ready in this very moment. He went back to Izuku, paper towel in hand, and noticed how Hizashi was finally coming to his senses, frantically walking around the front of the car with a pale face as he glanced from Shota to the boy. He paid closer attention to the green-haired boy who was currently soaked in vomit, though his eyes still found his husband to give him a reassuring glance as if to say, "It's not your fault," before approaching Izuku. "I'm just going to use this to wipe up some of the sick, is that all right?" Shota questioned gently, thin and pale hands unraveling the paper towel as he asked, mentally calculating how much he'd need to sop up all the mess down the boy's front. Out of his peripheral, he saw the boy's head move up and down slowly, causing the taller man to take that as a yes and approach him. "Okay, I'm just going to." He hesitantly reached outwards and scooped some of the vomit off the hospital gown, keeping his face straight and his eyes on the boy's chest. It instantly soaked through the thin paper towel, causing his hands to moisten and crawl with the urge to violently pull away. He didn't though, keeping his hands steady and firm as he quickly cleaned up the puke. He did his best, making sure to soak up as much of the liquid as he could. Once he was sure the boy's front was as clean as possible, he moved to the boy's face. He must have moved too fast, or perhaps it was the way the boy was still on edge from throwing up, but the second his hand raised, Izuku flinched backwards, body moving out of reach. Aizawa lowered his hand slowly, watching the boy open his eyes and pale. He looked like he might be sick again, eyes wide and fearful as he gazed up at Shota in a look that could only be trained into a child. A boy who'd been broken again and again and again, so much so he feared even the thought of physical touch because it had only caused him pain. He had to really fight to keep his voice and face even as he spoke his next words, not wanting to distress Izuku anymore. "Kid, are you okay if I wipe your face?" he asks, gently meeting the fearful green eyes and watching him relax a little, color coming back into his freckled cheeks. "Yeah. Sorry." He moved back to his previous position, shoulders still very much tense and posture rigid. Aizawa didn't want him to feel on edge, but he had a feeling no matter what he said or did he wouldn't be able to fix that right away. No, that would take time to heal. And even then, he had the feeling a scar would still remain in its wake. "You don't have to apologize, Izuku. I just want to make sure you're okay with me touching you. I'm sorry. I should have asked." He gave the freckled boy a soft look, keeping his gaze even and kind. He watched the green in his iris relax a little, shifting from something sharp to something that could only be described as childlike. He was relaxing not fully, but slowly. Like a tightly wrapped spool of thread he was beginning to unravel. Shota just had to make sure he came undone at his own pace. "Okay," Izuku said, nodding as he diverted his gaze down to the cloth in Aizawa's hand. Taking this as a go-ahead, the hero took the cloth and lifted it, albeit slowly and gently, towards the boy's face. He wiped at his chin, the spot below his lower lip, and the corner of his mouth. Watching as the boy tensed initially, but slowly began to lower his shoulders and unsquint his eyes. Once he was finished, he backed up and gave the boy space, watching the last of whatever strings were holding his muscles taut and brain in a whirl released him. He seemed to give Aizawa a thankful look, but the man couldn't tell if it was because he'd backed away or because he'd helped clean him up. "Thank you, sir," he said gently, and the tired man watched as he wound his hands behind his back. He could practically feel the way he was pulling at the skin, wringing and wringing like he was trying to squeeze the last drop of water out of a previously wet towel. He did his best not to stare as he diverted his attention to the mess of paper towels beside him, wondering where he would dispose of them. Seeming to understand his confusion, Hizashi decided to speak up from his place beside the car. "I've got a plastic container in the back we can stick them in," he offered, not making eye contact with the pair as he walked towards the trunk. It was obvious to Shota he felt guilty. The way he kept his eyes low and his body stiff was a clear indication of this. On instinct, Shota almost reached out to place a gentle and caring hand on his shoulder, before remembering they were carrying puke-filled cloths. Instead, he watched his husband pass him, trying to get the blonde to meet his eyes, but to no avail. Instead, he was met with the back of the man's head, and the way his shoulders hunched as he opened the back of their car up, reached inside, and pulled out a Tupperware container, before slamming the trunk with a bit too much frustration than Aizawa thought was really necessary. He extended his hand, plastic container in it, and waited for Shota to place the dirty napkins in it, before closing the lid and tossing it somewhere in the back seat. The tired man didn't hesitate to extend a hand and gently place it on his husband's shoulder, thumb applying pressure to the taut muscles in his shoulder. He felt the man freeze under his touch, lungs filling up with a harsh breath of air before he turned around to finally meet his eyes. "Zashi, it's not your fault, he was sick before we left," Aizawa whispered, trying to reason with the man before him so the guilt didn't completely eat away at him. Hizashi merely gave a smile, one that was too clearly forced and didn't meet his eyes, swallowing a lump in his throat and nodding. "Maybe you should drive?" the man asked carefully, treading lightly as his eyes flickered back to the little green bean. Aizawa felt his own attention shift as he looked at Izuku, who seemed to be staring at his feet with his head down. Shota didn't hesitate to give a nod, releasing his grip on his husband and stepping back, not pushing the conversation further as the tired man slowly surveyed Izuku's appearance, wondering if they'd be able to go into the nearby consignment store to grab some impermanent clothing before they took a proper trip to the mall and got him something new. The boy had, now dry, stains across his front. Though Aizawa had been able to remove the actual sick, the yellow spill remained against the blue and white of the hospital gown. His feet were still bare, and as the man's gaze trailed up the boy's legs, he noticed the knee he'd hit against the console's corner was beginning to ooze with blood, a slow trail of red sliding down his leg. He knew for a fact he had a band-aid in his breeks pocket, and though he'd love to patch the wound up himself, he reached into his pocket and pulled the beige band-aid in white wrapping out of his pocket, turning to his still extremely guilty-looking husband, and extended it gently. He nudged the man's arm with it, watching the blonde's face go from confused, brows drawn together, to understanding, eyes finding the wound, to hesitation, teeth capturing his own lower lip and biting harshly. "Clean his knee up, my hands might have bacteria from the vomit on them, I'm going to go grab the hand sanitizer and try and rid the stench," he explained, not giving Hizashi any time to argue as he shoved the band-aid in his hand and walked towards the car, leaving the poor blonde to fix both the knee and hopefully ease a bit of guilt. Izuku had felt sick before he'd gotten in the car, stomach churning with a lunch he hadn't fully given himself enough time to digest, and it didn't get better as the turns within the ride had become sharp and drawn out. He'd begun to feel like someone had thrown him in the washing machine and just pressed start. When he did vomit, he knew it was coming, an almost sweaty feeling gathering in the back of his throat before he tried, because he really tried, to hold it in. He covered his mouth and spewed his lunch on his hand, catching as much as possible, while keeping whatever else in his lap to refrain from getting it on the car. He must have done something wrong though, maybe it was the fact he threw up at all. Because despite Aizawa's reassuring words of how he wasn't to blame, and that it was all okay, Yamada didn't seem happy about something. And the only reason for that Izuku could think of, would be the fact he threw up in his car. Anxiety gathered in his stomach, eyes trained nervously on the ground as he shifted back and forth. His knee throbbed, but he couldn't bring himself to look at whatever damage he'd done to it. He assumed he'd broken the skin, he could feel something warm and wet dripping down his shin, and bit his lip to keep himself from even assessing it. There was a sharp inhale in front of him, and Izuku felt his eyes widen as he realized someone was standing in front of him and he hadn't even noticed. His chest tightened as he snapped his head upwards, posture stiffening and body jolting a bit as he made eye contact with the green in Yamada's eyes. Heart stuttering and hands shaking, he managed to make eye contact for a few seconds, holding his stiff and uncertain gaze, before the blonde moved. He didn't know why he flinched, why he stumbled, why his body moved back on instinct. All he knew is he couldn't control it. Because the second the taller individual moved his hand forward, he was jumping so far back he found himself tripping backwards, heels knocking with ankles as he tumbled backwards. He closed his eyes tightly, preparing for the impact as he fell. But instead, he fell into someone's arms, hands supporting the back of his head and lower back. He felt his eyes fly open, locking with the same he'd seen only moments ago. This time, nothing uncertain or apprehensive was in the green eyes he met. Instead there was a little determination, worry, and, was that hurt? Was he offended that I flinched? The boy thought in awe, lips parting a bit as he looked at Yamada in wonder. His brows drew together in confusion, jittery brain no longer working overtime, and though he wasn't comfortable, he wasn't afraid. "You okay, little listener?" the man asked, slowly moving to place him to his feet and adjusting the boy's stance so he wasn't wobbling. A still stunned Izuku let him move his limbs gently, processing the question slowly, but not really answering when he spoke. Why aren't you mad?" he asked in a hushed voice, swallowing and hugging himself tightly when he was fully released from the man's hold. He was met with a surprised intake of breath from Yamada, the blonde crouching down into a squat so he could better meet the smaller boy's eyes. He gave a tight-lipped smile, closing his eyes as he spoke gently, voice soft and kind. "Of course not, Izuku, why would I be mad?" he asked idly, keeping his distance and choosing not to touch him. That was definitely something Izuku could be grateful for. He didn't know if he could handle being touched right now. Not by someone he barely knew. "Listener." The words were spoken softly, like if he talked too loud he was afraid Izuku might shatter. It may very well be the truth, but Izuku couldn't help but resent the fact it was so obvious to others that he couldn't hold himself together. "I'm not mad at you. You have nothing at all to worry about. The whole thing was my fault anyways." It all falls into place in front of Izuku's eyes. He wasn't mad at him, he was mad at himself. Izuku felt himself quit breathing for a second. He had every piece of the puzzle and yet the picture was still so confusing. Why would he blame himself for something so out of his control? He might have been driving a little weird, but it wasn't his fault. Izuku had been sick before the hospital, they all knew that, so why? It hit him so violently, so harshly, that he felt like his world was crumbling under his feet because it was so clear. He'd spent this entire time, his entire life, blaming himself for things out of his own control. Hating himself for things he couldn't stop. Feeling guilty and wrong and messed up, and yet, here he could excuse someone else blaming themselves for something that affected him. So why could he never do it for himself? "Why, Yamada? You don't need to feel guilty. I'm the one who vomited. And besides, we both knew I wasn't feeling great when we left." Izuku talked slowly and carefully, treading lightly as he explained some of his thoughts. He couldn't fully say it wasn't his fault, maybe he'd never be able to admit it out loud, but even the smallest thought in his head that allowed him to excuse himself eased the guilt he felt and let him forget it quicker. It felt like he might be doing something right for once, and that's a feeling he didn't want to let go of. The smile Yamada owned only caused Izuku to feel better, his lips twisting higher at the corners as the guilt within his eyes faded further. "Thanks, kiddo, that makes me feel better." The words sent something sharp through Izuku's chest, and he felt himself unwind a bit within the adult's gaze. He couldn't really process much, other than the fact he felt innately better, like something dark had begun to let go of his chest. "How about we bandage up that knee of yours, you dig?" he asked, and though Izuku didn't quite know what the words, "you dig," meant, he could only assume they meant something like, understand or sound good. He found himself extending his knee with a sure nod of his head. Things were going to be better, they had to be. Izuku Midoriya decided the second he stepped foot inside the clothing store that he did not enjoy shopping at all. Piled in front of him were stacks upon stacks of richly colored clothing items, vibrantly labeled in neon oranges and reds with signs saying 20% off, or buy two get one at a discount, meant to lure indulgent adults and kids forwards like mind-wiped zombies slaves to the simple word, sale. The walls were all funky shapes and colors. It reminded Izuku of a kindergarten classroom or a rainbow, were the rainbow to have vomited its colors into a room. He felt himself frown a bit upon entering, body stiffening significantly as they entered the loud and overwhelming space. Because Izuku was definitely not the only kid in this store, and he could tell by doing a quick survey of the area with his eyes. Little boys screaming and fighting as they got dragged down yet another soul-eating aisle, babies crying, kicking, and staring judgmentally as their parents rocked them or held them like they were breakable china, toddler girls, fresh on their feet as they wobbled from one aisle to the next with a bright smile on their face or half their meals on their face. He didn't like this store at all, and he was beginning to wonder if he'd rather just stay in his sick-crusted hospital gown and remain shoeless for the remainder of his time on the planet. Izuku couldn't tell if there was a clear winner, and that in itself should paint a picture of how entirely concerning this scene was. "Izuku, are you okay?" The boy's head swiveled upwards quickly to meet a concerned and equally uncomfortable expression. Aizawa had a pinch in between his brows, as if he too was bothered by all the bright displays and items of clothing, and his eyes gazed at Izuku with a light squint in them to block out any extra light or noise the clothing decided to give off. The blonde, on the other hand, seemed to be energized by the bright and boastful aisle and people, smile on his face widening as he looked around. Izuku scrunched his nose up a bit as if to show his distaste, before speaking. "Just never shopped here before, that's all." The boy mumbled a bit, giving the store another scrutinizing look before swallowing the dry feeling in his throat and speaking past the frog who lived there. "It's a little bright and smells like..." He seemed to give a soft sniff, as if trying to place the specific scent this store gave off. "Fake fruit." He trailed off, taking another glance around as they plunged further into the store, the blonde leading them brightly. Aizawa hummed in response to the boy, as if he agreed with the statements, though if he had an argument or rejection to any of the latter's points they were quite well hidden. He didn't offer much else in reply, though he did put his hand out in front of Izuku like he was prepared to give him something, palm facing the ceiling. "Are you okay if I hold your hand, kid? The store may look small from here, but once we start going through aisles it'll look a lot larger." The man asked kindly, and Izuku couldn't help the way his eyes momentarily widened at the question. Truth be told, the boy had never actually gone shopping properly before. He didn't know what the rules were, how much was too much and how much was too little, if he was good at it, or even really how he was supposed to act around it. He knew shopping required money though, because whenever his father rudely would throw his clothes at him or slam a meal down in front of him, the first thing he'd complain about was how much money it cost, and he knew he didn't have any of that. He didn't know how he was supposed to tell the pair though, because they both seemed intent on bringing him here and picking out new clothes. It was an entirely new experience for him, and Izuku was still deciding if he thought it was good or bad. So, when Aizawa offered the boy a hand, explaining to him why he should hold on to it, Izuku didn't hesitate to take it. Mentally making note that the first rule of shopping was to hold someone's hand, filing it away, and letting the taller man's hand lead him further and further into the store. The first aisle they went down held a boy a few years older than Izuku, or at least, to the green-haired boy that's what it looked like. Then again, everyone in his class looked a few years older than Izuku. That's what you get for being 4 feet 3 inches and 56 pounds in the 5th grade. He was still counting on his growth spurt. The boy in this aisle was not holding on to his mom's hand though. He was walking around the aisle and pointing at something while his mother sat talking on the phone and simply either giving him a thumbs up or shaking her head while she spoke. He seemed bored, flipping through the clothing on the hangers bitterly while his mom ignored him, and for a second, Izuku felt bad for him. Their eyes met as Izuku walked in behind the two heroes, and when the boy saw him, giving his disheveled appearance a once-over, he seemed to cross his arms and glare. Orange hair fell into his eyes as he looked at Izuku with an unreadable expression, and the smaller boy found himself cowering absently behind Aizawa, fearful yet still curious eyes on the other kid. "Mom, there's some creepo," the kid exclaimed loudly, causing Hizashi to frown and Aizawa to give the kid a harsh glare. Izuku swallowed roughly, hands beginning to sweat as they gripped the other's hand in a firm and nervous hold. The orange-haired boy's reign of terror didn't seem to stop there though, because when his mom finally hung up her phone to look at Izuku and the pair who were watching him, she visibly frowned. Her hair was much like the boy's, curly and neon orange, though hers was almost down to her waist with how long it was. She held quite a thin physique, while her son seemed to be a bit on the rounder side, and she had freckles all across her nose and arms. When she looked at the three newcomers, she gave them all a look that could only be described as judgmental, before ushering her own kid along. "Yes, well, there's plenty of other aisles, Hikari, don't you fret about them." Her tone was icy as she exited the aisle, and Izuku felt his eyes go to the floor as the pair left. He most certainly did not enjoy shopping. Hey, Izuku, don't listen to them. Yamada crouched down to the boy's height, though he didn't have enough energy to lift his gaze from the floor. Trust me, little listener, there's plenty more people we can meet. And many of them will be much nicer than those two snobs. The blonde's voice seemed to raise a bit, and if it was intended to reach the ears of a certain orange-haired family. No one but Izuku and Aizawa had to know. Though Yamada's words were meant to be reassuring, all Izuku could really do was nod. He didn't feel like anyone would ever really like him. In school, most of his classmates mocked his height and hair. At home, his dad always called him useless and annoying, and his mom made sure he knew he was a good-for-nothing brat. His teachers always said he was much too thin and weak-looking to ever amount to anything, and he was sure most people who saw him either cringed or whispered about how he looked. It hurt, a lot, and he would be lying if he said most of it haunted him when it came to meeting new people. Aizawa and Yamada had been the first people to ever make the boy truly feel like he was lovable. And even then, it took a little bit of repetition for their words to sink in. Izuku didn't say any of that though. Instead, he gave a weak nod and faced his eyes forward again. Okay, he admitted softly, watching as the man gave a soft and reassuring wink, before standing up and setting off down the clothing aisle again. The green-haired boy took a breath, before looking around again, this time focusing his attention on the clothes. T-shirts, all of them seemed to be in order of size, not color or style, and he found himself giving a slight head tilt as he examined each and every piece of clothing. Yamada stopped in front of some smaller ones and began sifting through them quickly, hands working away as the clicking and clacking of hangers hit Izuku's ears at an uncomfortable level of noise. "Ha!" the man exclaimed as he pulled out a pastel green top with pastel yellow sleeve cuffs and neckline. The material looked soft, and as the blonde offered it out to Izuku, he used his free hand to take it and examine it for any sign of wear or tear. He knew it wasn't going to be ruined, though instincts had him making sure it wasn't already broken or covered in stains like most of the shirts his father had bought for him. So, when he found it was clear of any holes besides the sleeves, neckline, and bottom, he handed the soft fabric over to Yamada with a nod as if to say, "I like it." He gave a squeal of delight and began looking through the clothing rack again, before Aizawa reached forward and placed a light hand on his shoulder. "We're looking for a replacement outfit, Hizashi, not 27. The man deadpanned, watching as Yamada gave a very heavy eye roll before backing away from the clothing rack with a small smile. "We agreed, 2 breathes, 1 shirt, 2 sweatshirts, a pair of underwear, socks, and pajamas for tomorrow." He spoke sternly, as if worried the blonde might buy out the entire store if they stayed in the shirt section for too long. His husband merely shrugged and turned, gesturing for them to follow him as they made it through an abundance of aisles, picking up exactly what items Yamada though Izuku would need or like until they could find more permanent options than what their local consignment store had to offer. In the end, Yamada bought a plain white shirt and the green one, a black zip-up and a red hoodie, 1 pair of beige shorts, a pair of black leggings, underwear, socks, and atrocious yellow and blue striped pajamas, the only pair that looked like they would fit Izuku if they bought. By the end of it, Aizawa had a sour look on his face and Izuku found himself leaning softly into the man's side, head nestled just above his waist. They were waiting in line, when Izuku's eyes caught on the boy in front of them, and he felt himself analyze him just a bit. He had lavender-colored hair, a color Izuku found to be quite nice to look at, and in his arms he held a gray shirt and a pair of blue jeans. The boy was about Izuku's height, possibly a bit taller, and he had quite the thin physique. His father was different looking. He was on the older side, hair beginning to be sprinkled with salt and pepper, and he had bright blue eyes that rivaled the boy's purple ones. Izuku felt himself shift forward a bit. The boy's shoulders seemed a bit on the tense side, like he was anticipating something bad might happen. It was a look Izuku felt somewhat familiar with, a look that caused Izuku to move off of his dad's side a bit in an attempt to get a better view, only to find purple meeting green the second he moved. To us. Weird to say the least. The lavender-haired kid seemed to startle a bit at being looked at, before his eyes narrowed in an almost accusing stare and a bitter look crossed his face. Izuku shrunk backwards instantly, like a pill bug being touched, and yelped in surprise and being caught staring. He may not have been well equipped with social skills, But he had been told staring was incredibly rude a multitude of times in his life, so he knew he was most definitely in the wrong. His eyes went to his own toes, a harsh swallow being the only attempt at movement he made, and he was unaware to how the lavender eyes took in his appearance with a similar curiosity to the green ones. Unaware to how the boy's demeanor seemed to soften a bit as he searched from the hospital gown to the way Izuku held himself. Unaware as the boy was tugged forward by his haughty, and unaware to the way he reluctantly went back to facing forward. Maybe if he would have looked a little longer, he might have met the boy a little sooner than he was destined to. Alas, he did not. Izuku approached the bathroom with his head bowed, eyes stuck to the ground like it was a magnet weighing his head down. Maybe it was reflexive, a trait learned from years of being told he was better of dead. A tactic used to make himself shorter, smaller, less significant and noticed. Because if people couldn't see his face, they couldn't see his eyes or his mouth, and he couldn't see theirs. It made him look less present, like he was wandering on a path no one else could be a part of. Perhaps he did it because he was scared someone would take a look in his eyes and see everything, his nightmares, his hopes, his fears, his thoughts. He'd never heard of a quirk like it, but even the smallest glance could leave him feeling threatened, open, vulnerable. Or he was just ashamed to be living, breathing, walking, so he thought focusing on his feet and the ground made him feel less like he was him. Maybe it was a combination of the three, maybe he just couldn't pick a reason, and maybe that was okay. We'll be waiting for you, listener. Just a quick change and you're out. The voice of present Mike was dissolved in the background noise of chatter, walking, and squeaking carts. The world was determined to keep his focus on anything but the man's voice, trying to water it down with exterior sounds and the rapid beating of his heart as he clicked the door to the bathroom stall shut and tried to breathe. The tile was white against bare feet. The uneven pieces where the filling met cold ceramic made the bare bottoms of his feet itch, uncomfortable, skin finding a way to shift into the cracks like it was a second home. He did his best not to shift them too much, knowing that his body heat would hopefully remove the uncomfortable cold sensation pulsing through his body as he slowly placed his shirt and breathes down, focused solely on attempting to dress in his undergarments first. Izuku took a breath in and a breath out, before tiny brittle arms weaved their way behind his back and found where his hospital gown tied together. Fingers slipped between fabric as he twisted and pulled on the ties across his back. It took him a few attempts, arms needing breaks every few minutes, before he could fully remove the gown comfortably, and when he did his eyes lifted upwards for the first time in a while. He did not want to see his body, he did not want to know how many scars he carried or bruises remained, he didn't need a reminder, he wanted an eraser. Something to ease the pain that ached behind each and every piece of raised skin, cloth to hide his stomach and hips and arms, even if he'd seen those already. He didn't care. He just wanted to be free from the prison his body had him trapped in. He felt in front of him, refusing to even glance down for the clothes as he picked apart the underwear and slipped it on. The fabric wasn't uncomfortable, it was soft and stretchy and it felt nice to wear. He felt the corners of his mouth tug downwards, running a hand down his hips. The material was barely tight on his skin, the ends hanging off his thighs just barely, but the elastic seemed to fit his waist and he supposed that was all that really mattered. Izuku didn't dwell on the underwear for much longer. Instead he chose to reach back down and tug the soft and comfortable feeling shirt closer. He lifted it up over his head and closed his eyes as he shifted his face so he was facing forward, then he quickly pulled it down, fabric struggling a bit as it wheedled its way through his hair before falling down onto his shoulders. This was also new, the texture of the cloth was smooth. There weren't holes or tags or anything, it was just fabric. Izuku pulled the corner of his shirt between his thumb and forefinger, rubbing the silky yet flexible texture of the cloth between the two digits. It was so soft, Izuku didn't know shirts could be like this, free of itchy tags and uneven holes that rubbed and pulled taut against his back. No, this was so much better. The boy did his best to soak it all in, fully immersing himself in the experience of a good quality shirt, even if it had been worn before him. The cloth showed next to no signs of previous ownership, before finishing by pulling both the breathes and the hoodie over the outfit cautiously, taking next to no time to put them on before quietly exiting the bathroom stall. Outside of the big black box he'd been changing in awaited Aizawa and Yamada, and by the serious looks on their faces as well as their hand gestures, Izuku could tell they were in the middle of a very important conversation. His dad had important conversations all the time. He knew how they went and where Izuku needed to be during them, out of eyesight and earshot. Were he to screw something up in some way, he'd have to face the consequences. The boy felt himself swallow thickly, staring between the two men from afar until he was sure the conversation was over. But about halfway through a sentence, Aizawa's eyes moved to the right and he quickly snapped his mouth closed. The blonde saw the action and his eyes swerved over to Izuku's, a couple analyzing blinks visible as he gave the green-haired boy a once-over, before offering a tight-lipped smile. Izuku could tell something wasn't right, but he could also tell it probably wasn't his place to ask. Looking sharp, listener. Does it all fit well? How does it feel? Any complaints? The man reminded the smaller boy of a golden retriever, a breed of dog the little one had once seen when a classmate of his brought his dog into class for show and tell. It had been quite the wonderful presentation. The dog was instantly friendly with everyone and seemed to always be wagging his tail. The entire class loved it. Izuku also remembered his teacher explicitly telling him he wasn't allowed to show anything for show and tell because he didn't want him to bore the class. Izuku was quirkless, after all, so in what world would he experience any of the same joys as his fellow classmates? Him bringing something in would surely be a boring item only quirkless people would find entertaining. Certainly there was no other way. So, he didn't present anything, he just sat in the back while every other third grader came up to the front and proudly showed off an item or a thing, and he simply watched. Just like he did in gym class, recess, lunch, snack, sports day, field trips, and anything else the school could possibly use as an excuse to exclude the poor boy. Included in nothing, despite his attempts to prove his worth. Izuku snapped back to reality harshly, eyes widening a bit as he realized he'd zoned out in the first place before meeting Yamada's unwavering grin with a nod. All good. He simply stated back, beginning to approach the two men with both a look of hesitation and uncertainty on his face as he stopped a few meters away. Should I wait outside? The way he asked the question was soft and innocent, but the tight clench between his brows had the two men making brief eye contact before Shota spoke. Why would you need to wait outside, kid? The man asked, and though his voice was kind like always, Izuku couldn't help the way his brain sorted through the rough edges and cracks, dissecting every piece of evidence that pointed to the fact the two wanted him gone. He tried really hard not to think about it. Private conversation? He asked, as if he wasn't sure of the answer himself, because he wasn't. He couldn't tell if the couple wanted him to go wait outside for them to finish their conversation, if they were willing to discuss it in front of him, or if they'd rather just let it be and talk about it another time, or never again. It made his stomach swirl and his hands shake because he couldn't read them as well as he could read other people. It irked him. The man seemed to understand what he meant though, because in seconds he was squatting down to his height, dark eyes level with green ones as they gave him a soft, yet somehow still incredibly stern look. Izuku, just because we're talking doesn't mean you can't listen. We want you to feel included in our lives, and would never ask you to leave your comfort zone and wait in a busy store alone just so me and Zashi dash. Izuku did not flinch at the name. He stiffened a bit, his fists clenching minutely, but he did not flinch. Can have a conversation. You're a person and you deserve respect, okay? The man's words were kind and gently, speaking so his brain could clearly comprehend the true meaning behind what he was saying. He cared, he didn't want the boy to feel excluded or removed just because his presence might serve as a minor inconvenience. Izuku simply nodded, because even if he understood the words and the message, he still couldn't understand why. Aizawa drove home this time, and he was lucky enough that Hizashi didn't bother arguing. After the circumstances that transpired previously, Shota wondered absently if the man would offer to drive ever again. Even if talking with Izuku seemed to have settled most of his guilt, the man knew his husband's mind loved to blame himself for everything. The exhausted trio pulled into a parking lot, car pulling into their assigned parking position, and the subtle click of the engine as Aizawa cut it before turning around in his seat to look at a wide-eyed Izuku, who was surveying the apartment with an apprehensive look. He was dressed in his new clothes, hair still matted with dried blood and face still covered in grime. Aizawa made a mental note to ask the kid to take a shower. He doubted feeling all cakey and dirty was a positive sensation, but something about the way he eyes the building made the older man draw his brows. He didn't say anything as he exited the car, opening Izuku's door and watching as the boy unbuckled his own seat with shaky hands before slowly crawling out of the car and onto the pavement. His feet were still bare, something about how he needed special shoes because all quirkless people had extra toe joints and they couldn't find any at the store. Shota didn't hesitate to reach both hands up in offering. "Would you mind if I carried you up there, kid? The street is covered in stuff. I don't want you stepping in." The man's kept his tone soft and questioning, though his eyes were sharp and if you looked close enough, pleading. He wanted the boy to be safe, and walking around barefoot was anything but safe. It made Aizawa's stomach churn and his mind whirl as he tried to come up with any and every solution possible. Because what if he didn't want to be touched? What if he would rather walk on his own? Then what? Perhaps Shota could offer his own shoes, but then his feet would be bare, save for the socks adorning black cats on his feet. And even then it would still be a danger to walk. His train of panicked thinking went away as Izuku stepped closer and placed himself in between Aizawa's arms, clearly responding to the answer with a yes. The boy's eyes didn't leave their untrusting state, but there was a glint of hope somewhere within them. And Shota would be dead if he snuffed that out. Wasting no time, he quickly hoisted the smaller boy up and onto his hip. Even at 11 the kid weighed next to nothing, and as a hero, he'd held guys both twice his weight and height. So, carrying Izuku on his hip like a little kid was really no major issue. Thin legs wrapped around his waist and frail arms snagged across his neck, face absently resting on a shoulder to show his true exhaustion. The green hair on his head tickled Aizawa's neck, but the feeling of holding the kid in his arms, protecting him from even the smallest thing, just felt right. He did not say that out loud though, nor did he take the time to respond to Hizashi's questioning glances or waggling eyebrows. He was still the same stoic, blank, emotionless man that he was before he met this kid. Nothing had changed. Nothing at all. He kept carrying Izuku, ignoring all the peculiar stares and glances he got. For one, wearing a yellow sweatshirt that was soiled and dirty from days of wear and stress. 2. Carrying a child that looked much too old to be hoisted against his hip and much too dirty to be living in a proper home. 3. He looked like he hadn't slept in years, which though it might be true he had troubles when it came to sleeping, this was an entirely new ballpark. They took the elevator the rest of the way, chimes emitting from the machine as they boarded and exited the machine at their choice of destination. From the elevator, it was a slow and boring walk, before they finally reached the bold white door reading in shining silver their apartment number. Hizashi did the honor of opening the door, and Izuku lifted his head from Shota's shoulder to glance around. The apartment wasn't much, but it was home. There were 2 rooms. Shota took idle note that his room's door was open while the guest bedroom remained closed, one which he and Hizashi normally stayed and the other which had almost never been touched. It was meant to be a guest room, but neither him nor Yamada had really taken the time to have guests stay over other than Nemuri, and she nearly never stayed the night. The main bedroom had a bathroom within it, while the guest bedroom was simply a smaller room across from the other bedroom, and the bathroom whoever was staying there could use was more near the entrance. The living room was cozy, dark couch with a glass coffee table where Aizawa spent most of his time doing paperwork and drinking coffee. The TV was a flat screen, though it fit at an awkward angle against the wall that neither man living here had ever bothered to fix. The kitchen was a little messy, white marble covered in food while the cat's bowl lay on the floor, obviously displeased at his owner's lack of existence. Shota cringed a bit as he softly placed Izuku down, before walking around the kitchen table and making a move to fill his cat's bowl up. "We don't have a proper room for you yet, kid, but me and Hizashi have some time this week to help you settle in and set it up. You should have a proper room in the next few days," he says absently, filling the cat's bowl with enough food to feed a small cat army, before leaving it on the counter where it usually ate. Izuku's response was a hum of appreciation, though his eyes wandered around the apartment a tad uncomfortably. He shifted on his feet, as if confused and stressed, before meeting Aizawa's gaze uncertainly. "It's a good home." His words were unsure, like he didn't know if what he was saying was right, and Shota felt that same sense of unease he always did when the kid was around. "Thank you, Izuku, that's very kind." He decides on, watching Hizashi place a few things by the door before approaching Izuku with a smile, eyes warm and face welcoming. "Hey, Izuku, why don't you take a shower and wash up? Me and Shota here can cook some food, and then we'll help you get settled into the guest room for the night," he suggests brightly, pointing to where the guest bathroom is with a steady hand. Izuku doesn't seem like he understands the request at first, brows furrowing as he looks at the bathroom in a sort of confusion, before nodding silently. The two watch the boy enter the bathroom with fearful eyes, before shutting the door behind him with a click. The next sound they heard was the familiar turning on of the water, and the sound of the boy starting to get himself clean, and then they started dinner in silence, both listening out for any sign of peril within the bathroom walls. The shower pelted against Izuku's back rapidly, water streaming and running down his body as he stood under the freezing water. He shivered a bit, hugging his arms tighter to his chest as shaky and unstable hands took it upon themselves to reach forward and grab the shampoo and conditioner. He was shaking, trembling body shivering as he wiped water from his face, the clear liquid turning brown as it hit his skin and washed away. He hated showers. He hated showers. He hated showers. His skin itched with both pain from the cold and ached with a want for something better. Something warmer, and he was tempted. Oh, the temptation was absolutely eating at his resolve to turn the water dial up even just a tad. But Izuku knew how much warm water cost, and it was certainly not to be wasted on someone like him. No, he got cold water. He deserved cold water. The shampoo bottle in his hand slipped, and he fumbled to try and catch it before it hit the ground, reflexes slower in the cold than they would have been regularly, and he watched it drop to the floor with a clatter. The lid popping open as silver shampoo came oozing out of the hole and washing into the shower. And all that was going through the boy's mind was money, fear, wasted, useless, stupid, clumsy. He was dropping to his hands and knees and cursing as he struggled to pick the bottle back up and use whatever had hit the shower floor in his hair, hands as into the green locks in frustration as he roughly scrubbed at edges of dirt and knots. He cried at the spilt bottle, cried at how his scalp stung as he dug his nails into his skin, cried as the cold washed over him and he could barely breathe or think. About 5 minutes into crying, water had begun to crawl into his mouth and he was choking on the liquid, sobbing and shivering and wishing he could do something right. By the time he was composed enough to gather the bottle and place it on the shelf, run a small amount of conditioner through his hair, and scrub at his body, his lips and the tips of his fingers had begun to turn almost blue, losing their red coloring and instead becoming a deathly pale. He shut the water off with an unstable jerk of his hand, body wobbling as he slowly stepped out of the shower and into the bathroom. He didn't look at the mirror, he didn't process the way his hands reached forward to wrap himself in a black, fluffy, comforting towel, barely let himself realize as he began slipping his clothing on despite his shivers, nor did he think as he lead himself into the corner of the bathroom and crouched down in a fetal position. And he started crying again. Shota was oblivious as he aided his husband in the kitchen, bringing skis when needed, adding ingredients when asked, and mixing pots when ordered. He didn't hear the tumble as small hands dropped shampoo bottles, or the weak sounds of frail broken-off sobs, because all his ears could tune into was the sound of something sizzling or boiling. He didn't catch anything, barely noticed when the water in the bathroom had stopped running, and by now the pair were already beginning to dish out the food onto plates, pork katsudon. The rice had been wonderfully cooked by Shoyuta, and Hizashi had taken it upon himself to make everything else, frying and stirring and watching over to make sure his husband didn't mess the simplest job up. Now they were practically done. 3 plates were filled with steaming white rice, egg, soup, and pork topping and a pair of chopsticks stuck into the mountain of deliciously thrown-together food. "You think the listener's okay? He's been in there for almost an hour." Hizashi's voice came out slightly higher than normal, hands reaching out to place the plates on the table, to keep himself busy and from worrying about the boy in the bathroom. Shoyuta, in all truth, had also been concerned when the boy had not come out at the 30-minute mark, and even more so after they'd begun to hit 50 minutes. He didn't want to overstep, God, he didn't even know where a good place to step would be, But the boy's absence was more than slightly worrying. "I'm sure he's fine." A blatant lie, because he wasn't sure of anything. He was so unsure. Shota had taught classes. He'd dealt with rowdy teenagers who wanted to be heroes and help people. He shaped them into what their goals were, and if their goals were too weak or unbalanced, he let them go. Teaching was nothing like raising a child. He didn't know what 11-year-olds liked to eat, because when he was 11 he lived off of boxed mac and cheese and whatever he could find in the fridge or pantry. What about bedtimes? The man hadn't a clue what time most kids his age went to sleep because as a kid, Shota never slept. He'd be up and try to drown out the sound of his parents arguing in the room over. So no, Shota was new to the world of bringing up a child, let alone a child that had been traumatized by people who were supposed to protect him. A child whose parents were cruel and whose life was destroyed before it even got the chance to be lived. And as more time passed with the boy in a separate room, the senses Aizawa had seemed to lose at the hospital began to come flooding back. Because what if he really couldn't do this? "Shota? Honey? You in there?" The man snapped back to reality, thoughts coming to a screeching halt as he quickly focused his attention on his husband. The man had finished placing the food on the table and was now looking at him, arms crossed, in what could only be described as his worried face. The face he got when Aizawa went in his own head, the face he got when he knew something in his strong facade had cracked. What was that, Zashi?" He blinked a few times, eyes flickering over the blonde's facial expression as if he could decipher what he'd previously said, grasping at straws to make it look like he hadn't been spiraling like always. "I asked." The man began tilting his head a bit as his eyes narrowed. "If you thought we should check on him. Just a quick knock on the door." He finished, and though his posture was certainly less stiff than it had been before, the words were still said with that same accusing uncertainty. Because Yamada Hizashi had known Aizawa since they were teenagers, and he knew the tells the man gave off whenever he was nervous. Sometimes he could tell before Aizawa even knew himself. "Oh," was the simple reply, head shaking a bit as he turned to look over his shoulder at the door and stare at it for a moment before continuing. "I mean, it couldn't hurt. Do you want me to or?" He didn't look at Hizashi, praying to whatever upper being or force had control over his life that he'd volunteer Aizawa to do this. It wasn't that he didn't trust Hizashi, the man was practically a saint and he knew he would never lie to him, but he needed to know firsthand whether or not the boy on the other end of the door was all right. As if sensing the unease in Shota's posture and tone, Hizashi simply nodded his head towards the door. "Go ahead, Sho, I've got to grab utensils anyways," the blonde said with a sharp smile. Before making his way to the drawer, he kept the utensils in. Withholding the energy building up inside him to sprint towards the door, Aizawa, in a very calm and controlled fashion, made his approach to the door. He was vividly aware of the way the water around them had stopped running, the sound of liquid traveling through pipes completely null in the apartment, and his brows drew together. The closer he got to the door, the more apparent the sound of sniffles and sobs became aware. A mental curse, and then Shota was speed walking to the door, gently knocking to make his presence known. "Kid?" he asked through the door, one hand on the handle as he leaned forward so he could hear everything inside more clearly. The sobs grew into whimpers, the sound causing Aizawa to feel his heart literally shatter in his chest. He swallowed thickly and tried again. "Izuku, bud, can you hear me?" he asked, voice loud enough he knew someone completely present would be able to hear, but not so loud he was yelling or letting the fact he was panicking show. He heard the sound of shuffling, the voice that spoke next was weak and wobbly, like it was one touch too rough away from breaking apart entirely, and Aizawa tried to gently open the door only to curse when he found it locked. "I'm sorry." The words tore something apart inside of Shota, igniting his sense of being as he tried to hide the fact he was more than abnormally concerned. It didn't matter if the kid had destroyed their entire shower, ripped apart the walls and torn down the curtain, he would barely be able to scold him lightly before wrapping him in a comforting hug. Though, the man doubted anything as extreme as that happened. "It's okay, Izuku. You're okay. Can you open the door for me, please, kid?" He hated the way his tone was practically begging for the boy to open the door, the way he felt his heart hammer in within him, or how his brain went on a complete tangent at the mere thought of the boy being in distress. The sound of shifting was here again, before shaky and almost uncertain footsteps began to get louder until they were right outside the door. Aizawa could see the shadow, the way his legs were practically vibrating, and Aizawa couldn't tell if he was shivering or shaking, causing the unease within him to grow further. The click of a lock and the sound of the door handle turning was like the weight of the world had been released from the man's shoulders. The door only opened halfway before he was taking a light step into the room and almost visibly deflating in relief. Izuku was dressed, he had on the clothes he'd been wearing before, and his face were completely clean of dirt or grime, freckles becoming more prominent without all the dirt and dust blocking them from coming through. Green hair fell in curls around his ears, and as green eyes met his, there was a certain sense of anxiety locked within them. Taking idle note of the wet lines painted down his cheeks and the way his ears and nose were bright red, the man slowly made his way forward and crouched down to his level. "Hey kid, you're okay? You're Dash." He put his hands out forward, gently making a move to rub his hands across the boy's cheeks, only to realize with a certain amount of horror he was freezing effing cold. It caused the man to flinch a bit, warmer hand quickly encasing his face in an attempt to warm him up as he scanned the boy up and down. "Izuku, did you take a cold shower?" he asked in extreme disbelief, blinking a bit as the boy's brows went from absolutely terrified to confused in seconds. Yes. Can you tell me why, bud?" His voice was hoarse and uncertain, eyebrows drawing together. "Because I'm not worth enough to use the warm stuff." And if those words didn't startle Shota into response, he didn't know what else would've. His eyes went wide, hands reaching out to rub up and down on the boy's arms in an attempt to bring his body temperature up. "No." His words were final and protective, watching as the boy shivered a bit and flinched as his hands shot forward, but ultimately leaned into the warm touch on his arms. He startled a bit at the words that the man said, obviously getting more and more confused as time went on. "What do you mean?" he asked with a tilt of his head, voice still rocky and wavering. "I mean no," he clarified, looking up and meeting the boy's questioning gaze, warm hands slowly winding themselves within the boy's smaller ones and rubbing to create some heat. "You are absolutely worth the warm water. You can take hot showers. Okay? That's never going to be a problem, ever. Whoever made you think you couldn't do that is a horrible, disgusting, vile individual who will be dealt with accordingly." The man's voice was surprisingly calm despite the situation at hand. He kept their gazes locked for a few moments, before sighing softly and pulling the kid in close. There wasn't a flinch or a shriek of protest. The only thing he got in return was frail hands reaching up to grab onto his hoodie weakly as more sobs made their way from the boy's mouth. "Okay, K," was all the Aizawa could really make out before the sobs took over, and he made sure that the circles he rubbed on the boy's back were firm and quick, hoping with everything in him that he would be able to get him back to a more comfortable temperature. After a few minutes of calming the boy down and wiping his tears, he pulled away and offered a warm, or at least he hoped it was warm, smile. "Are you ready to try and eat something now, kid?" he asked lightly, and when after a moment's hesitation he got a sure nod, he stood and offered his hand before leading the boy out of the bathroom and into the kitchen. The only thought on Aizawa's mind being, even if he was unsure, at least he could be unsure and know that the kid was in good hands. Izuku did not like school, never had the hallways been kind to him, never had the teachers looked at him sweetly, never had the ground cushioned his fall, never had the kids laughed with him and not at him, never. So when Yamada brought it up, he almost dropped the mug of hot chocolate he was holding. You see, Izuku had been staying with the pair for almost a month now, and over that time they'd discussed many topics that had made the boy uncomfortable. Shota, the man had suggested Izuku use his first name since he was his guardian, had told him that if he ever wanted them to drop the subject entirely because he wasn't ready to talk about it yet, all he needed to do was ask. And when this topic came up, boy was Izuku more than simply tempted to ask. "Aizu, I don't remember you ever mentioning what school you went to." They'd been watching an episode of Friends, a show Izuku had found he quite liked even if sometimes the humor went a bit over his head, when one of the characters had mentioned high school. Izuku wasn't a genius, but if he had to guess what had sprung that wonderful train of thought, he'd have to assume it had something to do with that conversation. And now he was visibly tense as he shakily set his mug of hot chocolate down on the coffee table in front of him before turning to face his guardian. He was still getting used to wrapping his head around what that even meant, because having someone care for him in general was a new topic. Having someone guard him, as the word implies, was practically the same as leaving him in a foreign country and expecting him to know the laws. Shakily, the boy found himself setting his hot chocolate back down onto the table before him and drawing himself closer to Aizawa as the question rung in his ears. Well, I went to Masagaki Primary. We only had a week left when Shota, he tried. He was trying. Found me. The words were spoken casually, but the meaning behind them was darker. He tried not to notice the way Shota's hands protectively tightened around his body in a way he'd grown used to, or how Yamada seemed to string his brows together softly at the mention of why he was even staying with him in the first place. He seemed to sense the tense response, reading the boy's body language quickly and gently reaching out to turn the volume down on the television. Aizawa also seemed to acknowledge the atmosphere, tilting his head down to look at Izuku fondly. You okay to talk about this? I know you mentioned some things when talking with the detective. His voice, like it always was when addressing a topic like this, was gentle and caring. Izuku thought for a moment. He supposed they'd be placing him in a new school entirely when the first semester of middle school started, which he also acknowledged was in less than 2 weeks, but he still feared what would happen if he acknowledged his primary school and past peers. It felt unsettling, like there was something perched in his stomach, like a meal or a snack, wanting to force its way up his throat and into the world. Like the things he tried burying weren't dug deep enough and had decided to come up for revenge. But he always felt like this when sharing something, and Yamada and Shota always made him feel better. I don't really know. The boy answered softly, keeping his face hidden as he spoke. I do know what happened and I am okay to talk about it, but I also don't know. He let out a frustrated noise in the back of his throat, halfway between a huff and a grunt that it came out wrong. Like it's something I shouldn't talk about. I still feel like I'm going to get in trouble. I guess? It's odd. He muttered with his hands clenching and unclenching while he tried to think. Since they'd first brought him home and the first dreadful incident at the house, Izuku had been steadily and progressively adjusting to the house and the pair of men who'd taken him in. He still struggled with physical contact from anyone he didn't know unless he initiated the contact, but he was getting better at handshakes and subtle things with Nemuri, who'd come by more than once to say hi or hang out with the three of them. He was moving slowly, but he was moving and it felt good. Even if he still panicked when the lights went out. Even if the sound of pots and pans moving about caused him to jostle. Even if at times he found himself watching instead of being. He was still moving. So that's why talking about the school made him feel strange, because although he'd been moving forward at such a steady break, 1 foot too fast in front of him or one wrong step and he'd go tumbling backwards. He didn't want that. There was silence for a few seconds as the room processed the words that slipped past his lips, and for a moment Izuku gave hesitation on whether or not he should be the one to fill the room with noise again. After a second more of internally debating on what he should do, the words came tumbling out like an avalanche. I'm quirkless. And because I'm quirkless, people don't like me. It starts of rough, and though the words are strong his voice is weak, cracking and breaking. My last school just. A lot of people were really, I had a lot of bullies. And no one really cared. I don't want to go back to that feeling. He muttered under his breath seemed to catch in his throat. Both of the men in the room, though he wasn't aware, knew very well how schools could treat those without ideal quirks. Hizashi, who was muzzled for being too loud or too much. Shota, who was called villain and blindfolded by anyone who dared approach him. They could understand what the boy was going through, even if he wasn't completely aware of it. I.C. Aizawa said, hand lifting from Izuku's back and finding its way into his hair, gently carding through the curls in a way that made Izuku want to fall asleep. I think it might be worth mentioning just because you're quirkless does not make you any less than anyone who has a quirk. No matter what anyone says, a quirk is just a tool. It can be helpful, yes, but you don't need it to do anything. The man's voice is full of conviction, And though he says it, the words building within Izuku, making the next words fly from his mouth quicker than he can stop them. What if I wanted to be a hero, though? It comes out feeble, and though everything in him tries to keep it together, the second they come from his lips he's splintering off into a million pieces because he knows, he did not just ask that question. The question he's heard the answer to from many different perspectives. The question that's caused him so much unnecessary pain and suffering. It hurts to even breath for a second as he waits for a response, body stiff and demeanor cut from stone. Kid. Here we go. Izuku can feel the tears building in his eyes, feel the world around him beginning to crumble before him because everything was going so good. He was walking, he was moving forward, and this was it. This was the shoe dropping, this was his steps stumbling, this is what would set him back. All because he was quirkless, worthless, not enough, a simple Deku. Izuku, I want you to listen to me carefully. Okay? It hurts, like 1,000 knives piercing his soul and tearing him in different directions. Here he goes tumbling, falling, waiting for the impact. You can become a hero with or without a quirk. A hero isn't someone who's flashy and shows up with an overpowered quirk, because if that's what society called a hero, we would be set up for failure. A hero is someone who's been perfectly crafted, trained, and taught how to act and react to different scenarios. A hero is someone who is willing to risk themselves to save someone else. They are not silly quirks or hurtful words, or what the world makes them out to be. But most of all, a hero is someone the world can turn to when things get dark, someone they can trust, to guide them through and keep them safe. He's coming undone, silent tears beginning to fall as he feels the words carve themselves into his mind, arching and echoing through him like it's a chant. Someone hit the rewind button because he feels whole, more complete than he has in ages. He's not falling, he's floating, body sitting on cloud 9 as he feels like the world has given him another chance, another shot. You can become a hero. The words ring clear, like an alarm his past self set before he was diagnosed as quirkless was finally going off. You can become a hero. And he believes him.